Good. Baltimore City Council Budget and Appropriations Committee. Today we're going to start off with Council Resolution 17-0003R, Quarterly Budget Briefings, and Council Resolution 17-0004R, Budget Oversight Hearings for Baltimore City Public School System. Before we get started, first thing I would ask is that everyone that has a cell phone that makes some type of noise, please turn that noise off. Today we're not going to be taking testimony from members of the public. As you know, tomorrow evening is Baltimore City Council Taxpayers Night. That will be tomorrow, Wednesday, May 17th at 5 p.m. in council chambers. That will be an opportunity for members of the public to testify. We hope that you'll join us. That will also be streamed live on Channel 25 on Comcast, as well as charmtv.tv, the Charm City TV website. We have with us, two to my right, Council President Bernard C. Jack Young. Directly to my left, Councilman Leon Pinkett from the 7th District, Vice Chair of the committee. To his immediate left, Councilman Yitzi Schleifer from the 5th District, member of the committee. To his left, Councilwoman Mary Pat Clark from the 14th District, member of the, not member of the committee. To her immediate left, Councilman Ryan Dorsey from the 3rd District. To his left, Councilwoman Jane Miller. To Council President Young's immediate right, Vice President of the City Council, Sharon Green Middleton from the 6th District, member of the committee. To her immediate right, Councilman Ed Reisinger from the 10th District. To his immediate right, Councilman John Bullock from the 9th District. To his immediate right, Councilwoman Shannon Sneed, member of the committee from the 13th District. Standing up, Councilman Brandon Scott from the 2nd District, member of the committee with Ray. We have former Councilman Kiefer Mitchell from the 11th District, who is here with some money from the governor. We're joined by Marguerite Curran, staff to the committee, Kara Kunst, Council President Young's legislative director, Paul Plymouth, who works with Kara Kunst in the Council President's office. We have Karen Stokes, Director of the Mayor's Office of Government Relations. What we're going to do is we are going to hear these two City Council resolutions together. Again, these are for quarterly oversight. Right now, it is 2:21 p.m. The goal is going to be to complete this portion of the hearing by 3:15 p.m. so that we can jump into the budget overview for both BBMR and finance as well as city schools. So with that, I'd like to ask BBMR, Mr. Klein, if you could introduce your team and give a very brief presentation, limit it to somewhere in between 5 and 10 minutes, and if you could go up to the podium, please.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Mr. President, members of the City Council. I'm Andrew Klein, the City Budget Director. For the fiscal 2017 third quarter projections, Bob Senemy, the Deputy Budget Director, is going to give the presentation. Also have with me our Director of Revenue and Long-Term Financial Planning, Pedro Aponte.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the council, thank you. My name is Bob Senemy, Deputy Budget Director for the city, and I'm here to brief the council on the fiscal 17 general fund third quarter projections. I should start off by saying that the process for doing our projections is this projection is based on data through the end of March through the third quarter, and then our staff, both on the revenue and expenditure side, working with appropriate agency personnel, forecast what we think the revenues and expenses will be through the rest of the year, and that's what's reflected here in our projection. So we'll jump right into it. Overall, we are projecting a general fund overall surplus of $12 million. That's a slight improvement of what we shared at our second quarterly budget update. At the second quarter, we were showing a projection of an $8.7 million general fund surplus. So a small improvement of about $3.3 million. And of that $12 million surplus, 7.5 million of that is on the revenue side, and 4.5 million of that is surplus on the expenditure side. And we'll go into details on both of those in a moment. I should say that, a surplus of about 12 million, it represents less than a 1% variance for the budget. So this is about where we'd like to be at this point of the year. We budget conservatively, especially on the revenue side. So we'd like to end the year with a modest surplus that gives us some protection against anything that happens unanticipated at the end of the fiscal year. Just a reminder, there were two budget adjustments that already passed earlier this year that are accounted for in this projection. So there was a supplemental of $570,000 for a law department technology project that was heard by the council, signed by the mayor, passed. And then there was also Council Bill 170011, which was a transfer of appropriation to the fire department. And that was for the cost of the fire department labor union contract that was settled after the budget was adopted. And the cost of that contract for fiscal 17 is about $4.1 million. So those two items have been heard, passed by the council, and signed by the mayor, and they're accounted for in this projection. So first what we do is we'll look at the revenue side of the budget. And again, this is, there's hundreds of lines of revenue in the budget. We're just focusing here on the items that have either a large deficit or a large surplus versus the adjusted budget. So we'll go through these in order. The first, on the far left, the first two blue bars that you see that are below budget is personal property tax. And we're projecting a combined deficit of about $11.4 million versus a budget of $107 million for personal property tax. And the story here is that the state assesses personal business property tax, business property, and the city sends the bills out for the tax. And the state assessment process for personal property is a long process, and the city has been traditionally sending estimated bills for those taxes. And what we've learned this year is over the past couple of years that we have overestimated personal property versus what was actually assessed by the state, and this is catching up over the past couple years. So this year, where we found issues where we did bill a higher amount than what was assessed, we have either abated the bills or we're issuing.
Mr. Senemy, can you go back to the previous slide, please?
Sure.
Mr. President?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You said that the two council bills that we passed for the 4.1 million and the 570 is a part of the $12 million surplus? Did you say that?
So these are accounted for in our projection.
Out of the $12 million surplus that you talked about, right?
Yes.
Okay, well, explain to me how you can take 4.1 million from the employee retirement system. That has nothing to do with the surplus. That's inside of the retirement system.
Sure. The surplus is after that transfer.
Okay. All right, because I got a little confused on that.
So on the revenue side, the next item that you can see there is the enterprise zone tax credit. And so what happens is the businesses that locate in one of our enterprise zones, the state grants tax credits, but the cost is split 50-50 between the city and the state. And here, the city is absorbing a higher cost for a handful of credits that were issued after the budget was passed. And that's a cost of about $4 million. The next line item is state highway user revenue.
So just to go back for 1 second.
Sure.
So after the supplemental of $570K and the transfer of $4.1 million, after that supplemental and transfer were completed and enacted, there's still a $12 million surplus.
That's correct. That's right.
Got it. Thank you.
Well, that ain't the way I heard.
And you can see in the budget adjustments column, that, Mr. Chair, that's the $570,000 because that was a supplemental. The transfer was just between expenditure line items. So, in state highway user revenue, these are funds that are distributed from the state from the gas tax, titling tax, vehicle registration fees. We get an update from MDOT on this information every quarter. and they're projecting our share to be about $3 million below budget. Our budget was about $142 million, and we're expecting $139. And then the final deficit line item, large deficit line item, is a net transfer from parking funds. So all of our parking revenues first go to pay for the maintenance and the debt service on our garages and for parking enforcement costs, and then the net proceeds flow into the general fund. The 17 budget included a proposed tax increase, the parking tax that did not pass, and so the general fund revenue is now absorbing part of the cost of that shortfall, and we're showing that on the revenue side here. On the positive side of the equation, transfer and recordation taxes, I like to combine that first one, recordation, with property transfers, the one on the far right, because they're both based on housing market activity. And what we're seeing there is that we've traditionally budgeted very conservatively there because this is our most volatile revenue source. If activity picks up in the housing market, we see funds quickly, and if it drops off, we see the funds decline very quickly. So we budgeted conservatively here. We're showing a combined $14.4 million surplus versus budget. But I should note that the level that we expect to see at the end of 17 will likely be below the 16 actual. And we think that that's because we're starting to see interest rates creep up, and so we're seeing a little bit less activity in the housing market, and especially less activity on refinancing transactions. Income tax. So we've told this story before. We're projecting a surplus of $9.6 million versus a budget of $317, and we have seen a shift over time, over the past couple of years, that our income tax has gotten stronger. The Baltimore City taxpayer we have a higher net income taxpayer than we did a few years ago. We actually looked at some census data that was the 2015 census data, and we had a shift of 13,000 households reporting under $50,000 of income that now shifted into over $50,000 of income. So we're seeing that reflected in our income tax data, that we have a higher net income taxpayer in the city. We're still clearly the lowest in the region on a per capita personal income basis. We're still well below other jurisdictions in the region, but we have seen our profile of our taxpayer grow in terms of income tax. One thing that we have not, that is not shown here that I wanted to mention is that we are expecting $7.5 million by the end of the year of reimbursement from FEMA for reimbursement from the cost of last year's snowstorms. Our expenses were excess of $40 million. FEMA reimburses the city for just 3/4 of your most expensive 48-hour window. So that's only a portion of what we spent. The reason we're not showing it here is we'll be recommending that we transfer those funds into our rainy day fund to help us better protect against future emergencies. So on the
Bob, hang on one second.
Sure.
Councilman Pinkett.
Hey, Bob, I just wanted to ask a question about the recordation and the property transfer.
Sure.
Does your analysis show that there were any particular city actions, policies, credits that led to this surplus, or is anything that we did intentionally?
No, we just have traditionally budgeted conservatively here just because of the volatility.
Mm-hmm.
Even in the last 10 years, we've been as low as about $40 million in this source and as high as $115 million. So there's nothing that we've done. It's just we budget conservatively to be safe. And we did anticipate that as interest rates started to creep up, we might see a little bit less activity in the market. So on the spending side, we wanted to highlight just the agencies where we're seeing large deficits and also agencies where we're seeing healthy surpluses. On the police department, we're projecting an $18 million deficit by year end, and this is not really much of a change versus the second quarter. We reported the same thing at the end of the second quarter. Again, the story here is that we do have vacancy savings because we have about 230 vacancies in the department as of May 1st. And what that means is that they're filling those positions and filling slots with overtime. And the deficits in overtime spending and with severance when folks attrit out of the department is more than the savings that we're getting on vacancies. So we're still seeing about the same that we saw the second quarter for police department. On fire,
Bob, hang on one second, Mr. President.
Thank you. The $18 million in overtime for the police department, and we haven't seen a reduction in crime. And you said that they have vacancies. Well, this council used to have 19 members. And because of the population decline, this council was cut down to 15. We have a police force that is for 1 million people. We don't have 1 million people anymore, okay? So we have to work smarter, and we have to get the police officers to start walking the beat. That'll help drive down crime. Now, I never would have said, no overtime for the police, because I understand sometimes you have to have overtime. But if you keep spending and the police department keep having an open checkbook, they're going to spend. So when is I mean, you guys go in and you cut $2.4 million from after-school program stuff that's benefit our youth, but yet continue to let the police department run up these deficits year in and year out, and they have an open checkbook. If I had an open checkbook, I would spend too. I don't mind spending overtime if I see a reduction in crime. I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing an increase in shootings, increase in murders, and I'm not blaming the police for that, but they need to be out of those cars. They need to be engaged in the community, and I'm not seeing that. So I expect for finance to start looking at that budget and maybe take that budget and let someone else manage that budget, because you cannot, a business would not allow one of their stores to constantly lose money. We ought to do something, and I'm holding finance accountable to do something about it.
Councilman Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Sinema, it's my understanding that the majority of this overtime is being used in patrol, and we know that is the cause of that is that the schedule is in the FOP contract. I know that we're not going to, do we see that continuing into the next fiscal year, or do we believe that we're going to be able to get that out of the contract before the next fiscal year? Because if not, it seems to me we're going to be having the same conversation.
Yeah, part of it is the contract, and that is the city is negotiating currently with FOP. That's one of the topics, but that's as much as I can share at this point on that. Part of it, though, is the attrition. We've seen so much attrition that just to fill the slots that we have, we're having to call folks in on overtime because we've lost, consistently so many officers over the last couple of years.
So exactly as my public safety vice chair said, that the reason for that is that it's in the schedule, but also I think that we were able to get from them some numbers and figures around that, and they told us that basically the majority, I think 70% is what they gave us, of the overtime was because of the schedule. So for us, especially we're going to be now discussing their budget for next year, next week, not knowing is not a good enough answer from us. We need to know, is there an end in sight for the schedule being inside the contract? Because if not, we're going to be consistently having this conversation. And yes, we understand that we cannot have patrol shifts going out below their constant level that they must meet. But at the same time, as the president saying, we can't continue to pay overtime for basic patrol when it's netting us no results.
Right, understood. And I think certainly at the police department hearing, they'll be prepared to talk about the implications of the schedule, because it is part of our discussions in negotiations. On the fire
Councilman
department
Pinkett.
side, sorry.
Bob, do you know how many positions that $14 million in savings
So
represents?
as of May 1st, there's 240 vacancies, 134 sworn, 106 civilian. That's a little bit higher than it's been. On average, it's been closer to 200 throughout the year, so it's grown a bit over the course of the year.
And just hypothetically, if those 240 positions were filled, how would that translate into overtime? Would that mean that $28 million of overtime
Would increase.
that we wouldn't be facing that deficit?
Right. We wouldn't be facing nearly that size of deficit on overtime. I mean, overtime
so we have to be extra aggressive in filling those vacancies, yes, so that we don't continue to have this. I mean, that's got to be the priority, right?
Yes, either filling the vacancies or having a schedule that requires less bodies.
Thank you.
So on the fire department, we're projecting a $6 million deficit for fire, and there's a couple things going on here. First is we had built into the 17 budget, we'd assumed that we would increase the EMS fees that we charge for folks that get transported on a city ambulance, that we would increase the fees and that would generate $4 million of revenue. That fee increase ultimately was not approved, so that cost us $4 million right off the bat. Our base revenue in EMS fees, though, has been higher because there's been higher volume, so that has helped offset that cost. Also, fire has seen a similar issue in police in terms of slow hiring and turnover, so we do have vacancies in both suppression and EMS. We have, the good news is we did just hire a new class of 40 trainees in suppression, but they're still in their training and they won't be being able to man shifts until next fiscal year. So we do expect overtime costs to continue here through the rest of the year, and we're projecting a $6 million deficit by year end. We have been working on the fire department to just figure out the right schedule for training and what size academy classes, how often we need to bring them in so that we can stay as close to fully staffed as possible. On the expenditure side, surpluses, health, finance, library, housing, big surpluses, but again, all these are driven by vacant positions. We're projecting a $12 million debt service surplus, and that's based on a revised payment schedule for our debt service this year that comes from the Treasury Department. So we budget each year based on a schedule of when the cash borrowing is expected to happen, and as timing lags or gets pushed back, there's less debt service expenses required in the current year. So for closeout, we will be, our office will be submitting actions to close out the fiscal 17 budget. Again, we're balanced overall. The charter requires us to be balanced overall, and it requires us also to be in balance by all of our agency appropriation budgets. And so the two agencies that we mentioned, police and fire, we will be submitting actions to the budget committee to close out fiscal 17. For police department, we'll be proposing a transfer from the debt service surplus that we just mentioned, $9 million of that. In addition, we'll propose a $9 million supplemental from excess income tax revenue to close the police appropriation deficit.
Hey, Bob, excuse me one second, Mr. President.
Yeah, I was wondering from the debt service, how much is in the debt service, and how much is in this income tax? If you can get that to the committee, so that we'll know, because if we can transfer that kind of $9 million from both of those, I'm quite sure we can find $13.5 million for our priorities.
Okay, we can send. Yeah, the debt service surplus is 12, so we're proposing to use 9 of that. In the income tax surplus, going back to the 9.6, so we're proposing to use almost all of that. And so we will be.
Bob, hang on a second. Go back to. Can you please go back to that the major revenues chart?
Sure.
Can you show me where the
income tax?
I see the income tax, and where's the debt service?
The debt service is over on that's on the expenditure side, so that would be a transfer. That's a spending item, so it's just a transfer between a surplus and spending.
So just walk me through, if we're comfortable using $9 million of GO debt service to cover police overtime, which should have been resolved already, why is it that we can't use the additional $3 million available in GO debt service to take care of the council's priorities, like helping to close the gap at city schools?
So we'll talk a little bit about that, because these actions just close the budget but still leave us with about a $13 million surplus, and we'll talk in just the next slide about what we're proposing to do with those funds. So in terms of the end of 17, we wanted to start the conversation about what to do with surplus if it materializes, with where we have our money set aside at the end of 16. And so at the end of 16, we had $70 million of fund balance available. And assigned fund balance is basically money that has accrued over time from surplus that we have set aside for potential one-time needs. I should mention that of that $70 million, it's actually $100 million. We're not showing the 30 that has already been set aside. as part of the solution for the city schools over the next 3 years. So 70 is what we have assigned at the end of fiscal 16.
So when we say 30, we know that the mayor made a commitment of 22.4 million this year. There was a 90 million commitment over 3 years made. So that leaves us with 67.6 million. So you're saying 30 of that 67.6 million over the next 2 years?
Over the next 3 years is coming from fund balance.
Well, not 18, over 19 and 20 is coming.
18, 19, and 20.
So we've got 30 of the 90 covered so far is what you're saying.
Right. And we'll talk a little bit more about the solutions in the 18 overview, about the full sources of those. I just wanted to note it here that the full balance is 100, but we thought it would be misleading to show 100 when it's already been earmarked for the schools over the next 3 years. These sources, these funds here, of the 70 million, the 50 million is a contingency fund that we've set aside for the fire and police pension litigation. So as you know, the pension reform that was passed years ago is still under litigation. It's in state court. And we have set aside $50 million in case we don't prevail in state court, that we would have back payments that we would owe to our retirees. The second line, the BCPS, the surplus schools and debt service, as part of the 21st century school modernization, we have been slowly taking over and will continue to take over schools that are surplused. And we will either need to demo some of those buildings, redevelop, put some capital improvement dollars into those buildings, and on top of that, as we take over certain school buildings, if they were financed with state bond debt, we will be required to pay off the debt service. So 17.6 million is likely not nearly enough to do all the work that we'll need to do on those buildings, but we have been, as we've had surplus, we've been trying to tuck some aside for those purposes, because those will be one-time expenses that will incur over the next 8 to 10 years. And then the DOJ consent decree, at the end of fiscal 16, we had anticipated that we'd have capital needs related to the consent decree, and that did come true. So we did set aside $2.5 million. That's actually in the 18 budget to help pay for the capital projects that we'll need to do as part of the consent decree. The big ones are a data warehouse to track all the data that we'll be collecting, and to help fund the mobile data computers that officers will have in their vehicles. So that's appropriated in the 18 budget. We don't have any money assigned for our grants deficit, but we are reporting a $77 million grant fund deficit as of the end of 15. So that's something just to note, that we have not been able to pay that down, and that has become an audit issue within the last year. So to get back to your question, Mr. Chair, with the surplus, the $13.2 million, if it materializes, because this is still a projection and it could come in at that amount, a little bit less, a little bit more, but if that surplus materializes, what we're proposing to do is to put it towards these categories, to beef up our F&P pension litigation contingency fund to make sure we have the full amount covered, and to throw more at the BCPS line for surplus schools and debt service, which will be used to redevelop or demo those buildings that we have.
Why would we take that money when we have something that needs to be done with it this year, and we've had $50 million sitting in fund balance for fire and police for how long now? 3 years?
So it's been 3 to 4 years now.
3 to 4 years? How much money do you think we need to have in there that will satisfy finance?
So we have each year that this litigation has gone, each year we have to we reach out to our actuary to get an estimate of what we would owe in back payments if we did not prevail on the litigation. So each year we've actually added a little bit, and we'll be reaching out to the actuary again before the end of this year to figure out what that amount is. But the last report had us at near $50 million.
So wouldn't it make sense to focus on trying to get that resolved instead of continuing to add to it?
Yeah, it's in state court, so it's out of our hands at this point.
So what's the time frame for that?
We don't know. Yeah, it's up to the courts.
I mean, are our attorneys arguing that we are just sitting on $50 million that our school system needs?
I mean, our attorneys are defending us in the case, but the resolution again is in the hands of the court. So,
how long has this been going on, start to finish, or start to current? Because there seems to be no finish in.
Yeah, at least yeah. The reform was 2010.
Council President Young?
Yeah, so if it's been going on for 7 years, it could be going on for another 7 years, and we have 50 million sitting in a pot, and we need money for our schools, after-school programs. If it took us 7 years and they haven't done nothing as of yet, we need to be using some of that money. Because it's unlikely that the city's gonna lose that.
It's a contingency in case we're not to prevail, so we feel like we needed to protect for that first before other priorities.
Well, we can take at least 12 million out of that. I know we can.
Mr. President, we don't even have to take it out. They're planning on putting 13.2 million in there this year. We've already got the money.
That's what I said.
No need to even touch any of that. Vice Chairman Pinkett?
Right, just don't put it in.
Right, just don't put it in. I just wanted to make a statement related to the surplus school debt service. And this isn't necessarily directed to you, but probably more so, and I'll keep saying it to DGS, BDC, and housing, that for some of the schools, especially part of the 21st century schools, we're going to know in advance that they'll be closing. So it behooves us to prepare, a development plan or strategy for those schools so that so that when they come offline, we already have a plan of action to either surplus them or to, dispose of them to a developer or whatnot.
Agree.
And not waiting until, after the schools have been vacated and now they come on our books. We've got to do that. And all of us should be encouraging those agencies to develop plans for those schools.
Definitely agreed.
Councilwoman Clark?
Yes, excuse me, well, I gotta go back to 101.
Okay.
We have what's anticipated surplus, I've written it down 2 different ways. I have 13.2 million
Yep.
anticipated for the end of the fiscal year.
That's right.
And now, are you giving us the way that the Budget Bureau would like to spend that money on the fund balance page?
No, so this is the fund balance that already exists, and if the $13 million surplus does materialize at the end of the year,
If it does?
if it does, this is still a projection. We have 3 months to go. We would propose splitting that money up among these sources.
So, wait a minute. So these are not,
Councilwoman, can you talk into the microphone, please? This is being recorded.
apologies.
It's okay.
Let me, so are you saying, what are these numbers under fund balance? Are they what we need or what?
No, that's what we have. That's what we have. That's what we have currently.
Before we get a surplus?
Yes.
So you're saying we anticipate a surplus, which you know we need. And we have these amounts in the fund, and we would want to add to them?
Yeah. Yes.
Is this the fund that the circulator got a loan from? What fund is this?
No. This is just general fund balance. This is so these are funds that have surplused over the years, and we have assigned them and designated them for these purposes.
So basically, we have a surplus, but then if we get a surplus, Finance would, or the Budget Bureau would want to apply the surplus that we generate to these causes.
Yes, that's right.
And you don't have them covered in the budget?
No, because
Already?
No, these are not covered in the budget, and that's so. For example, if we weren't to prevail on the litigation, we would owe $50 million, and that's why we've set aside.
But that litigation's been going on since I was a child bride. And the 17.6,
Yeah, and the 17.6 is not.
I mean, I live with this every day in my district with the schools that close and the this and the that, and I understand what you're saying, but 17.6 is a meaningless number given, I mean,
So it
17 doesn't mean much.
But we will have one-time costs to either surplus, to surplus these schools, to either demo them or do redevelopment, and to pay off the debt service. And if we
And
don't
we will sell them.
And if we don't have money set aside for that, then we'd have to find money in the ongoing operating budget, which is hard enough to balance. So we've been trying to.
But it is a buying and selling operation. And then 2.5. Are you saying that we didn't put aside the money that we are obliged to put aside for the technology of the DOJ?
So in the 18 budget, there was $5.5 million of operating funds put for the cost required for the consent decree. That's the monitor, that's the folks we have to hire to do training.
But you didn't put the technology in?
No, $4.5 million is in the capital budget for technology training.
Oh.
But 2.5 of it is coming from fund balance, is coming from this source.
Coming from the surplus.
Coming from here, from our fund balance. Our existing fund
So
balance.
I know how long it takes us to spend money on technology for the police department. Years. I think if we have half of it, we got all of it for 18. Okay, just wanted to know what I was looking at. Thank you for,
Sure.
thank you.
Councilman Scott. Oh, and I'd like to introduce our colleague from the 8th District, Councilman Chris Burnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Sinema, just a quick question, because as it was stated, we know that this litigation has been taking place since 2010. Let's just say you don't add more into it this year, so to speak, and it comes out that the very unlikely case that we do lose this year. Wouldn't that also be a case where you could go to the rainy day fund?
We wouldn't recommend that. Our current rainy day fund is at 120 million, which is about 6.5% of our next year's operating budget. That's well below what most cities have available for emergencies. And as we've seen over the past few years, we have had significant emergencies that we've needed to dip into that. So we wouldn't recommend to do that.
So I understand that, but what I'm saying is that leave the 50, just don't add to it this year. That small amount difference that it would be. Do you know what for example, can you tell me how much of the money that you're putting into this is going to go towards the litigation for this upcoming fiscal year?
So we're not sure yet. We're getting a report from our actuary that will tell us how much more we would need to be fully
Ballpark
protected.
figure, maybe?
I'm sorry?
A ballpark figure?
No idea, because it's based on investment returns versus the old legislation. It's hard to predict. That's why we've asked the actuary. But we'll know. We'll ask for that and have that later this year.
No, thank you. If you could provide that to the committee as soon as possible, I think that would be greatly appreciated.
Okay.
When will that be provided?
We'll reach out to them right away. We've been getting an estimate each year, and we'll reach out to them again. It probably will take at least a few weeks for them to run the numbers.
So can we have a date on when we can expect that information?
I can't commit to a date because it takes them time, but we'll get it as soon as we can.
So can we get that information by, say, June 2nd?
We'll let you know right away. We'll ask for it and let you know.
Because I think this committee is going to have a difficult time entertaining a budget in which there are significant pieces of it not provided to the council in advance. And I would think that the amount of surplus that's going to go to fund balance is something that you would agree, and any reasonable person would agree, is a significant amount of money, correct?
Yeah, and we'll do our best to get that information and forecast it.
Thank you. Are you good on your presentation?
That was it. Unless there's any other further questions from the council.
Colleagues, any further questions for finance?
I have a question.
Councilwoman Sneed. Colleagues, if you have any questions, just grab me or shoot a card down here.
I just want to make sure that because going back to page 5, when we say assume, we thought that was going to happen. Is there any way that we cannot do that? Can we not just assume if it doesn't pass, or if it's, because it doesn't make sense to me to put that in there to guess that we can guess on anything.
I'm sorry, which one?
On page 5, under fire, because you say we assumed. So I'm wondering too, is there anything else in the budget that we assume that we guessed on?
No, that would be
make a major
baked into the
impact.
projection.
And then to say, moving forward, that if it's not already passed, if it's not legislation passed, then don't put it in, because that's a big chunk to me.
Yeah, this was something that didn't require council approval. It was a BOE action that would have been required, and it was put in the 17 budget by the prior administration, and the current administration decided not to pursue it.
Sure, that's all I want to ask.
Councilman Reisinger.
Mr. Chair, I just want to echo what the president and my other colleagues are saying. I think that this year, I think this committee really has to look at the assigned funding balance that we're putting into different accounts, because that's money that we could probably really look at to appropriate our priorities. Because we're always saying, I mean, no offense to the finance department, but they're saying that's their recommendation. And as a body representing our constituents, is that we got to look what's our priority in the city of Baltimore for recreation in schools and public safety. So that's just my statement, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilwoman Clark?
Yes. Could you do us a favor as a committee, send to the chair for our distribution, just a running fund balance history of the rainy day fund
Sure, we can do
from
that.
its origins?
Sure, we have that. We can send that to
Yeah,
the
I'm
committee.
sure you do. And could you do that? And let me ask you a technical question, because I always get confused. This fund balance and what you do with it, that happens after the budget, does it not?
So
Does it come in supplementaries?
No, it happens after the end of the fiscal year, once we determine, after closeout and after the audit is complete, how much we actually have available of what we assign it to. So it happens actually at the end of the fiscal year.
So
Yeah, and even
would
the-
it
even
come
this-
to us
and
through
even-
supplementary appropriations?
And I should say, even the 16 is an estimate because the 16 financial statements are not final yet, so it's an estimate.
Let me just be direct. I'm just asking you when we get our hands on it. When we, the council, see it.
So so with the quarterly budget hearings that we do, we'll also do a next fiscal year, we'll do a kind of a recap of how we actually closed. So when we do our first quarter projection for the fiscal 18 budget, we'll have a better idea of where we closed out, and we'll give estimates at that point. So that will be in the fall.
Well, let's back it up a little bit. How does it come to us? If you decide to go forward with these numbers here on fund balance, page 8, when does that come to us here in the city council? How does it come to us?
Well, it won't. I mean,
It won't come to us,
not necessarily,
because it's not in the budget.
unless we're proposing to appropriate funds from that source.
So basically, we'll see it as a supplementary,
Potentially, yes.
or never see it at all,
Or we'll appropriate it in the budget if we use it for.
within the budget,
Within the budget.
without our agreement,
Correct.
without our action.
Yeah, well, it'll be in the proposed budget that the council acts on.
This is the proposed budget.
Right.
So, but is it in here?
There are,
Aha, it is in here.
well, there are certain sources from fund balance that are in the budget, but it has to be appropriated either
Gotcha.
in the budget or as a supplemental.
Bob,
I hear you. So in other words, we go to these sources and find some money, and we compare it to what potentially will be added to those numbers, if there is a fund balance. Got it. Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Chairman,
no problem, Councilwoman. Bob, at what point in the year do you usually check with the actuary? Because it seems like this is a repeatable process, something that you've done the last 6 years.
Yeah, we've done it the last few years. I don't remember what time of the year we've checked with them.
Prior to the closeout?
About this time of the year.
Wouldn't it make sense to go to the actuary prior to submitting the proposed budget to the Board of Estimates, so that you have an idea of what you're going to do with the surplus instead of coming back here and telling us what you're going to do with the surplus?
I mean, we could certainly ask earlier.
Okay. Mr. President, that seems like something that's reasonable, colleagues, that we would have that information prior to the budget being introduced. Absolutely. Councilman Schleifer.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So just for a point of clarity, how much is the amount of money that you were looking to this year approximately, without hearing from your actuary, for the police and fire pension litigation?
We don't
Was
know.
it that 12 million number? Or,
No.
You know,
No, so we don't know how much we would need to, if any, to add to that particular source until we hear that.
and when did you guys start paying into that fund? Was it immediately, or was it only after a couple of years?
The
and you saw
contingency
no-
fund, the fire and police contingency fund, we started right away, probably fiscal 12 or fiscal 13 is when we started putting money into it, knowing that if we lost the lawsuit, that we'd have to pay it back, and we've been adding to it.
Okay, so then on average, you're basically putting in about $7 million a year on it. So would you anticipate at least of that $12 million surplus, there's at least still $5 million available?
No, you can't assume that, because the amount that gets added is they're comparing the current legislation that's in place versus the old legislation, and it's dependent on the rate of return that the pension systems earn, so it's not the same amount every year. That's why we have to ask the actuary to get that data. So I can't estimate what.
Yeah, but that's a pretty big gap. I mean, if it was, you know, a little bit different, that's one thing, but I mean, it's not going to be 75% different.
It wouldn't be that size,
Okay.
but.
So in any event, even after putting money into this, to the pension litigation fund, you should still have a pretty sizable chunk available.
Well, like I said, the second line, the surplus schools and debt service, we don't think 17.6 is nearly enough of what we'll need over the next few years to do the redevelopment or demo or to pay off the debt service. So our recommendation would be to plow more into that line as well.
I mean, even though in your revenues, you guys are projecting that you're going to look good at the end of the year also. Like in addition, on page 4, you're showing that even with some of the deficits, your projected revenues more than cover that. Actually leaves a gap of about another $8 million. Or was that included?
We're projecting a net $13 million surplus
all
at the end.
cumulative.
All together.
Gotcha.
Altogether.
So-
Those were just the big high items and the big low items.
Gotcha. Okay.
Hey, Bob, what was the number that the actuary used last year?
It was the 50.
No, I mean, what was the increase? I'm sorry.
I don't remember. We'd have to go back and look at the reports.
Can you, Mr. Klein, can you have one of your staff go pull that data right now so that we have that information prior to the end of this hearing? Is there a reason why we couldn't just go look in the budget book as to what was in the fund balance for that line item each year? Would it be published in these quarterly briefings that you've been giving this committee over the past couple years? So I'm just wondering, like, we started at 0, of course, right? And we're at 50 today. Can you use a microphone, please, sir? Thank you. Wherever he's comfortable.
Did he see what now? Mr. Chair?
Yes.
This is where the council is council at its president or? Love it.
So, Mr. Chair, I think what's important is the next information we get from our actuary in terms of what we're going to need as of now, if we lost the lawsuit and what we'd have to pay back. So that's the number that we're going to get as soon as we can to the committee.
I still can't comprehend why the information is not readily available. The amount of money that you are putting in as one-time deposits annually to this fund balance account. There's got to be someone in finance who manages that account or has oversight of that account.
No.
Well, we get information from the actuary, and we will, we'll provide that information to the committee.
No, I'm not talking about the actuary. There's a fund balance account that has $50.0 million in it. That fund balance account started at $0. Over the course of time between day zero when it was created and day today, May 16th, 2017, deposits have been made to that fund balance account.
That's not a separate account.
So the fund.
These are assignments that are made by the Director of Finance of the assigned fund balance.
So we have one fund balance account in which you have essentially earmarked on a piece of paper where those funds are dedicated to go.
Yeah, we inform accounting of the designation, of the assignments.
Do we have this?
You know that.
Do we have this? No, he got it.
There is a fund.
I'm still not understanding it, and I don't think any of my colleagues are understanding what you're saying. There's one fund balance account, and where the funds in that are directed to go or are reserved for is based on what you have on a piece of paper. I know that when I save money for Christmas gifts, I open up a second savings account, and I put that money in that second account. You cannot tell me
There is a
how much is in the. You have one account that has $7.1 million.
Yeah, the funds are accounted for as assigned, unassigned, committed. I mean, there are designations, but within the assigned, there are not separate accounts for each of these line items.
So, how much interest are we getting out of fund balance each year?
Not much.
What's not much? That's not
We can, less than 1%
Less
in
than
recent
1%
years
per year?
because we can only invest in treasury securities.
right. So we're investing in low yield. Where are the proceeds from that interest going? Back into the other fund balance accounts proportionately?
Yeah, they go into fund balance.
So what controls are in place to prevent you from saying, I want 7.6 of BCPS to go to fire and police pension?
Nothing?
I mean, these assignments can be changed based on the circumstances that are in front of us.
So this is fluid.
It is fluid.
This is what you project at any given time and is subject to change at the direction of you.
Right. When we are aware of specific fiscal risks, our goal is to be as prepared for those as we can, and that's what this represents.
And making changes to this fund balance, like let's say tomorrow you decide that 7.6 million needs to be transferred from BCPS to fire and police pension litigation, you have the power to do that unilaterally without city council action or approval.
The finance director does, yes.
Yep.
But again, we can't spend it until it's appropriated. And we need the approval of the council to appropriate these
There's
funds.
no scenario in which you can spend money without having it appropriated first?
No.
Snow removal isn't funded without appropriation first? That didn't happen in 2016?
I mean,
You expended the funds
If-
to pay for the snow removal.
we know we're going to have a deficit, we inform the council that we're going to need a transfer or supplemental to balance the budget.
No, I was just backing you up that it exists.
I think we're good.
And
I think we're
and I think you did a good job of that.
All right. Mr. President, colleagues, you guys ready to move on to schools overview? You guys ready? Everyone good? Moving on to schools. All right. Dr. Santelises, thank you for joining us today. And Bob, thank you very much. Mr. Klein, thank you. Dr. Santelises, if you could quickly introduce your team.
Thank you.
Oh, and I'd like to recognize my colleague from the 1st District, Councilman Zeke Cohen. Councilman, my apologies.
Thank you, Chairman Costello and City Council members. It is my pleasure for the first part of today's presentation, which will be the third quarter fiscal year 17 report, to introduce our interim chief financial officer, John Walker, who will walk us through. We also have for part two, our FY18 preview, we have with us as well our chief of staff, Allison Perkins Cohen. We also have with us two school board commissioners who are joining us today that I want to thank, Commissioner Cheryl Kashani, and want to thank Commissioner Linda Chenia for joining us. And then we have a number of staff who are also serving as backup. So without further ado, Chairman Costello, it is my pleasure to introduce John Walker.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the City Council. I'm John Walker. I'm the Interim Chief Financial Officer for Baltimore City Public Schools, and I have a much shorter presentation on what we did as far as our forecast is for fiscal year 17. We've given you a one-page document that gives you an idea of what we did. And just to give you a little bit of a background, from a revenue perspective, Baltimore City Public Schools doesn't have the fluctuation that comes with other units of government, because all of our revenue comes from pretty much the state and the city, and it's pretty much set before the fiscal year begins. So there's really no fluctuation on our revenue side. If we anticipate we're going to get a certain amount of revenue, that's pretty much what we get. So we concentrate more on the forecasting side, and what we did is we used our numbers, our actuals as of February 28th for our general fund expenditures. And as you'll see, what we did is when we came through and we broke it down, we saw that once we put in certain, we put in some freezing in January of 2017. Once we saw where we were potentially going, we put a freeze in place where we froze expenditures, and we also put a freeze to slow down our hiring. And as a result, when we did our forecast as of February 28th, where we were expecting to get about a $10 million surplus at the end of the year for fiscal year 17, it looks like it's going to come in more at about $20 million. And that's based mainly on the fact that we put the freeze in, we froze expenditures, we froze hiring, so we had a higher vacancy rate. In the document that I handed out, you'll see that we had about $13.8 million in projected salary surplus this year, and another $18.1 million in projected fringe benefits.
Sorry to interrupt you, John. I didn't hear what you were saying. The 20 million was what?
The $20 million is what we are projecting to have excess of our expenditure balance at the end of the year.
Got it.
And we were planning on having $10 million way back in January, because that was part of the solution we were using for our close the gap. So we're coming in a little bit better based on the fact that we froze our expenditures, and some things came in, like utilities, for instance, where we had budgeted at rates that we thought they would be in 2000. They came in lower. Gas prices went down, oil prices went down. So we saved a little bit of additional dollars there. So we're looking at a little bit better of a position in 17, and that'll give us more flexibility in what we do. What we did is we closed our gap for fiscal year 18. The only other thing I have to report is just to give you an idea. We did give you copies of our third quarter, March 31st financial statements that you all have, and I won't run through them unless somebody has any questions.
What is, without getting too much into the fiscal year 18 budget, what does BCPSS usually do with its surplus? Does it just get rolled over, or?
In most cases, it's similar to what's done here. It goes into our fund balance, and in previous years, we've used a significant, for instance, fiscal year 17, we used a significant portion of our fund balance to balance our budget. $53.7 million of our fund balance was used to balance our fiscal year 17 budget. In fiscal year 18, we're proposing to use about just over $20 million of our fund balance. So reducing that, because as we've talked before, part of the reason that Part of the reason that city schools had the budget gap that they had something to do with the fact that we had been depending so much on going into our fund balance for one-time fixes as opposed to looking for sustainable solutions that would help us deal with our structural gap. So as each year went on, more of our fund balance was going into funding the subsequent fiscal year.
And how much is currently in the fund balance for city schools?
I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of about $39 million.
Okay, so and it's projected to have an additional 20, which basically isn't going to go in there. It's
Yes.
going to be part of the solution.
Yeah, and we're required to have between 3 and 6% of our next year's operating budget in fund balance. So that we thought at one time when we first started doing this, we thought that we might have to go back to our board and ask that we actually go below that 3%. But because we came in a little bit better, we'll be able to maintain that 3 to 5% balance.
And you're right at the bottom of that range, right?
Yes.
3.1, 3.2,
Yes.
something like that. Okay, thank you. Colleagues, if we could limit our questions on this just to third quarter closeout and fiscal matters related to this year, we're going to get to the fiscal year 18 budget very shortly in the next hour or so with city schools.
Gotcha.
Crickets.
Okay, thank you very much.
Colleagues? Nope. We heard you. Everyone good? All right. We're gonna take a 5-minute recess, and then we will come back for the second two bills. This is the Budget and Appropriations Committee of the City Council. We're here today to hear Council Bill 17-0065, as well as have a high-level discussion of a subsequent ordinance, which we expect, resolution of the mayor and city council, which we expect to receive, which will cover the budget for the Baltimore City Public School System. Before we begin, if you have any mobile devices, please be sure to put them on silent or anything that does not make noise. We will not be taking public testimony today. We will be doing that tomorrow evening at Baltimore City Council Taxpayers Night, which will be Wednesday, May 17th at 5 p.m. That'll be an opportunity for citizens to discuss their concerns and questions about the budget. Tomorrow evening, we'll start with a very brief presentation from BBMR, as well as the city school system, and then we will get directly into public testimony. City council members will not be asking questions. This would, again, just be an opportunity for citizens to voice their concerns. I should note that this is the first of several hearings for Council Bill 17-0065. We will be reconvening after today on Tuesday, May 30th at 9 a.m. There's a full schedule for the entire week going through June 2nd. If you need that information, I believe that is or will be posted on the Baltimore City Council website very shortly. With that, I'd like to introduce to my right, City Council President Bernard C. Jack Young. To his immediate right, Councilwoman Sharon Green Middleton, Vice President of the City Council from the 6th District and member of the committee. To her immediate right, Councilman Ed Reisinger from the 10th District. To his right, Councilwoman Shannon Sneed, member of the committee from the 13th District. To her immediate right, Councilman Zeke Cohen from the 1st District. To my immediate left, Councilman Leon Pinkett from the 7th District, Vice Chair of the committee. To his immediate left, Councilman Yitzi Schleifer from the 5th District, member of the committee. To his immediate left, Councilwoman Mary Pat Clark from the 14th District. To her left, Councilman Ryan Dorsey from the 3rd District. To his left, Councilman Christopher Burnett from the 8th District. To his left, Councilman Bill Henry, member of the committee from the 4th District. And finally, Councilman Brandon Scott from the 2nd District, member of the committee. We're going to start off with the Department of Finance. We are going to ask that you limit your presentation to 10 minutes. Mr. Klein?
You didn't tell, okay.
No, that's okay. It's only 39 pages.
Can I just talk really fast?
Yes. If you could quickly introduce the members of your team. I know we did have a representative from the mayor's office, Director of Government Operations, Karen Stokes, who will be joining us back here briefly. And I forgot to introduce Marguerite Curran, staff to the committee, as well as Kara Kunz, Council President Young's Legislative Director, Paul Plymouth, who works in the Council President's office alongside her, as well as Councilman Robert Stokes from the 12th District. And with that, Mr. Klein, please take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. President, members of the City Council, for the opportunity to provide you an overview of the Board of Estimates' recommended budget for fiscal year 2018. Joining me today is Deputy Budget Director Bob Senemy and our Director of Revenue and Long-Term Financial Planning, Pedro Aponte. I didn't know about the 10-minute rule, so I'm going to have to make some decisions on the fly about what to cover and what not, and what to skip over. So wish me luck.
I'm sure he'll make the right decisions.
So you may have seen this chart before. This is rewinding to the very beginning of the fiscal 2018 budget planning process. Our estimates at that time were that we would see a $56 million increase in revenue, but the cost of maintaining the current level of service, meaning the level of service provided in fiscal 2017, would be $76 million. So we were looking at a $20 million shortfall. And some of the highlights of that, a portion of our property tax revenue is now dedicated to the Children's Fund. That's about $12 million. We had the cost of complying with the Department of Justice consent decree report on our police department. We've budgeted about $10 million for that. Pension and health benefit costs have continued to grow. And if you take the cost of living adjustment of 2% for all employees plus pension and health benefits, it's about a $40 million increase in employee compensation year over year in the baseline. The pie chart there just shows you that nearly half of the general fund budget is consumed by what we call fixed costs. Those are costs that are difficult for us to control in the short term, and they include our pension contributions, our mandated payment to the public schools, debt service, retiree health benefits, workers' compensation, and certain other expenses. Just looking at some highlights of the fiscal 2018 recommended budget. I mentioned that we have closed the shortfall. We're presenting you with a balanced budget as required by the charter. This budget provides $22.4 million in what we call bridge funding for the schools. This is funding over and above the fiscal 2017 appropriation. The commitment the mayor has made is $90.2 million over 3 years, and $10 million of that annually will be an increase to maintenance of effort, so that will become a permanent increase. The rest is temporary. The hope is that by the end of those 3 years, the state will have adopted a new school funding plan based on the Kerwin Commission recommendations, and that process is ongoing. But the initial research and reports coming out of that commission indicate a formula that would be more favorable than the current formula for the Baltimore City Public Schools. We have continued property tax reduction in this budget, the 20 cents by 2020 plan. So we're reducing the effective tax rate for owner-occupied properties, and I'll talk a little bit about that unless I run out of time. We're maintaining core city services. Most of our services are funded at the current level of service. So you'll see only a few enhancements, and then we also have a reduction in the police department base budget. I mentioned the 10 million for the DOJ consent decree. We have shifted 5.5 million in base funding from the police department to provide the increased funding for the schools. Youth fund is 11.9 million. That's based on 3 cents per $100 of assessed value, and by charter. And a few of the initiatives, I'll talk about them now in case I don't have time to expand upon them. We are funding new mobile workforce centers, and we have funding in the budget for 3 of these workforce centers, staff them, equip them. We believe that we will have the vehicles themselves donated, but we will have the cost to operate and maintain them. We have some new strategies to clean the city. That includes expanded use of the so-called big belly trash cans throughout the business districts in the city. Also, small haulers program to reduce illegal dumping. And also another initiative in this budget is Be More Bright, and that will accelerate the installation of LED bulbs in our 80,000 streetlights. It will also install 6,000 new streetlights in areas where they are most needed. Just looking at the top line of the budget, operating budget, all funds, 2.8 billion. That's an increase of 4.7% from fiscal 2017 adopted. The capital plan totals 1.1 billion. The general fund is at 1.8 billion, an increase of 4.1%. And the number of positions in the budget is just down 0.5%. And that's mainly because we've transferred the full cost of street sweeping from the general fund to the stormwater fund. And that's just a history of the number of positions. Grant funding, we rely to a large extent on state, federal, and other grant funding. And since we're pressed for time, I won't go into too much detail. I will highlight that in our state grant funding, we are receiving $3 million, which we are matching with $750,000 to extend hours at our libraries. The emphasis there will be on underserved neighborhoods, but you should see extended hours across the system. In federal grant funding, I do want to note that between operating and capital, we rely on federal funding to the tune of $220 million a year, and President Trump's proposed budget threatens significant portions of that funding. Community development block grants, community services block grants, the home program, you add just those elements up and it's almost $30 million. And so that is a concern that may not hit us in fiscal 2018, but certainly in 2019 if that becomes a reality.
Mr. Klein?
How am I doing on time?
Councilman Scott? No, you didn't run out of time yet.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Klein, I just want to talk about specifically on the second item when it talks about the $1 million reduction for youth and violence prevention, and we know that was through grant funding. But it seems to me with what we have now on the streets of Baltimore, which is really in a crisis situation, that we would find that money somewhere else in the budget, and it's not just particular to this particular piece of grant funding, but also when you think about the cuts that are proposed for the coordination of public safety strategy, we can't afford to lose those things, especially when we're at a rate right now to have the most homicides that our city has ever seen. Yeah. So can you talk about like the thinking behind even coming to the council proposing a budget that does not find a way to fund, as we just talked about, fund balancing and funding all these other things through grants, and to not actually provide that because it just looks bad. The optics of it are horrible. We have young people dying. Councilwoman Middleton just had a 17-year-old young girl die in her district, and for us to then say that we're going to come and propose a budget and we're going to have a $1 million reduction for youth violence prevention from a program that we know works, that we know if we cut those 60 guys are going to go back out there and they're going to go back and pick up a gun.
Yeah. Councilman, administration agrees with you. I mean, what we're reflecting here is a loss of state funding, and the mayor has directed me to try to find 1.2 to 1.5 million dollars to fund safe streets for fiscal 18, and we haven't solved that yet, but we will come to the council as soon as we have a plan.
Thank you, sir.
I'm going to skip utility funds.
Is there anyone want to hear anything about utility funds, or should we keep going?
Yeah, and that's something that you could talk with DPW in detail at their hearing.
Everyone good on utility funds? Casino revenues?
I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. I was being spoken to in my other ear. Are you asking for
No.
taking questions now?
So what I'm doing is stepping through the pages in the interest of time. And kind of grouped together, so I'm just gonna call them out, and
I got you.
Bob, are you rolling the or Andrews, Mr. Klein?
Yeah.
I'm just gonna step through them. So utility funds on pages 8 and 9. Is there any questions or anything burning that our colleagues want to discuss? All right. Page 9, utility funds. Page 10, casino revenues. If you could go to that, Mr. President.
Mr. Klein, with the table game revenue,
Yep.
I think I read somewhere where the table game revenue was higher than expected. Am I correct?
Table games revenue, our estimate for fiscal 18 is 7.2 million, and that represents 5% of the table games revenue from Horseshoe Casino only.
Okay, so we didn't
started to get that. We started to get table games revenue this fiscal year when the Prince George's County Casino opened. So we're getting about a half year, and that's what we had planned for in 17. So for 18, this reflects the estimates we've received from the state in terms of a full year of table games aid.
Okay, and the money is already spent?
Well, the money has to be, half of the money is for recreation
And half for
facilities
schools.
and half for schools. The state is taking 2% of the funding.
I thought it was 1%.
It's 2% for another purpose.
No, I thought they were taking 1%, and 2% go to schools, and 2% go to recs and parks, and that's my understanding.
No, it's,
I have to
yeah.
check with the delegates to find out, but that's what I
Pedro,
thought.
you
they were
looked
told.
at that, right? It was,
It's two, they taking 1%.
yeah, so it is, it's 2% goes
2%?
to a minority business program at the state level.
Uh-huh. So that means
And then
one,
the rest is split 50-50 between
God, I
those
didn't know
two
that. Okay.
purposes. And we have budgeted the 98% that's coming to the city. That's all reflected in the budget.
Okay, so that's already spent.
Yes. Well, it's not spent yet, but it's reflected in the proposed
I mean,
budget.
but it's already.
It's accounted for.
Yeah,
if you
okay.
want to
that's-
put it that
okay.
way. Yeah.
All right, because I was looking to see if there was any extra revenue there. Okay.
Yeah, and the half of the horseshoe funding now goes to the community benefit district.
South Baltimore Gateway Partnership.
Yep. Any other questions about casino funding? I should mention, so at the bottom, the 12.5 million from lease revenue, 90% of that is dedicated to tax relief and 10% to school construction. Okay. So in terms of the revenue outlook, you can see the impact of the improving economy from fiscal 08 through 13. Our revenue grew at an average of 0.5% a year. Since 2013, it has picked up the pace to an average of 2.7% per year. And for fiscal 18, we will have new revenue from the restoration of the traffic camera program, We are also assuming $1 million in revenue from municipal advertising, and we'll be briefing the council when we have more details about that program. This is just looking at the general fund revenue sources. I guess the main point is we still rely on the property tax for half of our general fund revenue. And if you take just three sources, property tax, income tax, and highway user revenue, that makes up 76% of our general fund revenue. So I'll talk about those three in a little bit more detail. We're seeing continued property tax growth. Now, you see this is personal and real property. The $11.9 million for the youth fund comes out of this total. We also have a new tax credit, a supplemental homeowners tax credit that will cost about $4.5 million, and that will also come from that total, along with other tax credits that already existed. Whoops. This is a history of property value growth. Our growth for Group 2 for fiscal 18, 6.2%, and that'll phase in over 3 years at 2.1% per year. This is the progress we've made on reducing the effective property tax rate for homeowners under the targeted homeowners tax credit. So we are estimating that the average effective rate in 2018 for owner-occupied properties will be $210 per $100 of assessed value, and that's a 7.5% reduction since fiscal 2012. The cost of that, the targeted homeowners tax credit, is $26 million in fiscal 18. $14 million of that is covered by the casino lease revenue and property taxes. The remainder is absorbed by the general fund. So I mean, that's a cost, just like an appropriation for a city agency. Income tax has grown 26% since 2013. Bob mentioned some of the factors involved in that as the composition of our population is changing. Highway user revenues, they peaked at $227 million in fiscal 07, declined dramatically during the Great Recession as the state shifted funding away from the Transportation Trust Fund into the general fund, and they've recovered only modestly since then. The figure for fiscal year 18 includes $5.4 million in new funding to subsidize MTA transportation for our students. Otherwise, we would be seeing a decline in highway user revenue based on the state projections. I talked a little bit about fixed costs, so I won't dwell on it here. This is just showing the trend. The fixed costs in 18 are just slightly over $800 million, actually a pretty small increase over fiscal 17. We do have some modest growth in pension and health benefit costs, and debt service costs are down in fiscal 18. Pension, you can see overall, this is for all funds, not just the general fund, increasing by $7 million. I want to point out that fiscal 18 is the last year of phasing in the 5% employee contribution for the employee retirement system. So as of 2018, about $16 million is coming from employee contributions toward our overall contribution, and you can see since fiscal 15, when this started, our contribution, the city's contribution has actually dropped a little bit. Now, going forward, there's going to be upward pressure because we're no longer adding to the employee contribution. We have lowered the assumed investment return in both of our major pension funds, just facing the reality that we've seen. And we've made other changes that are putting the systems on sounder footing but cost the city more money. Health benefits, again, this is looking at all funds, active and retiree, so we'll be spending about $250 million. This is showing the impact of the reforms we've made over the years. The gray bar is what our actuaries had projected going back to fiscal 2013. If we had continued with the same set of policies versus the changes we made, and it's about $100 million in annual savings. Unfunded liabilities have shrunk, primarily in retiree health benefits. Our unfunded liabilities in our major pension systems have continued to grow, and ERS is about 71% funded. F&P is 68% funded, so we only have about 2/3 of what is needed to meet future obligations under our current investment return assumptions. But we have reduced the retiree health benefit liability by a significant amount, as you can see, from just over $2 billion in fiscal 11 to about $740 million in the fiscal 16 valuation. Recommended budget plan. So we built the budget around these outcomes and indicators. You have those in front of you. I won't read them. I do want to highlight that this is across all funds in this budget. We are spending more for education and youth development than for police. And included in our funding for schools, that includes, it totals about $360 million. That includes $268 million in maintenance of effort, plus the additional funding that we are providing in fiscal 2018, $17 million in general obligation bond, $19 million in debt service, $24 million as a contribution to the 21st Century School Modernization Program. And then beyond schools, we are spending $150 million on a variety of other workforce development, recreation, health, and other programs that are targeted for youth. That includes $12 million for the youth fund, $6.8 million for Family League after-school programming. And the police budget, as I mentioned, the base funding is being reduced by $5.5 million.
These side by side.
I think I highlighted these earlier.
Can we go back to that previous slide, please, Mr. President?
Because you can't make me believe that we're spending more on education than on the school, on the police. Can you?
I can provide the details of that for the, to the committee.
We'd like to have those details.
Sure.
And when you're talking about adding more to education, you can't put in the 11.9 million or the 12 million. That shouldn't even be included.
Well, that's part of our investment in education and youth development.
But it should not be included.
It's a
because
legal
it's separate.
requirement.
It is separate. That is separate. The youth fund has nothing to do with the education and development.
Mr. President, this is all
It really
funds.
does not. It should not be included.
That is a fund.
Therefore, the police department gets more money than education.
Excuse me, John, how much is the budget for city schools, please? Yep.
I can look it up for you in a couple minutes.
If you could get back to me on that. Yep.
You can add that on to the-
So I talked about these initiatives earlier. I want to mention that the $22.4 million for city schools includes $10 million from fund balance that Bob mentioned earlier, a $5.5 million reduction in the base police department budget, $4.5 million from a reduction of our rainy day fund contribution, and then 2.4 was built in as an increase over fiscal 2017 for maintenance of effort. I want to make sure to explain that our 3-year commitment is for $90.2 million, so that's $22.4 million in 18, another $32 million in 19, and $35.5 million in 20. So when we were talking earlier about fund balance, that may be where the additional funding has to come from.
Where are we, page what?
29.
29.
I'm sorry.
Oh, 30.
31.
31?
31.
What is this?
And we talked about the MTA funding and extended library hours as well. And then the remainder of the slides are just highlighting some selected results that we expect to see from this budget. You can read those, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Chair.
Councilman Henry.
Good afternoon. So let me go all the way back. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that we were supposed to be asking on a page-by-page basis. So going back to the very first page explaining the gap,
Okay.
I was struck by the proximity by which in the language at the top you say the projected budget gap is 20 million, and then immediately underneath that there's an item that costs 20 million, which is the 2% pay increase for all employees. So my first question is, how much flexibility do we have on whether or not to implement the COLA this year?
You know, it's subject to negotiations with our unions. This reflects a standard COLA projection. It's not policy, but
so I mean, I just want to understand what's on the table.
Let me be clear about that.
Have we negotiated this 2% raise already, or is this in here so we can negotiate a 2% raise?
We've completed, well, we're close to completing negotiations with the fire unions. We are still in negotiation with CUB, ASME, and FOP.
Okay, so that was the first question. Second, on the page.
But I should say, Councilman, that the budget does anticipate an average 2%
No, I
pay
get
increase
that.
for all employees.
The council is not ever involved in the negotiations with the unions,
Right.
so we don't know where we are unless we ask somebody.
Sure, understood.
So second, on page 28, the comparison between youth and police funding.
Yes.
I want to agree with the council president and say that including the $361.3 million that we contribute towards a school budget 4 times that size, when we have not just a moral but a legal responsibility to the state to provide that funding, calling that comparable to the completely discretionary $500 million we're spending on the police department rides the edge of insulting. We are spending $151.4 million on youth and educational and arts grants, youth health, wellness and safety, youth recreation, and youth employment development and library programs. We are spending less than 1/3 of discretionary funds on youth compared to what we are spending on the police department. And that's not even getting at where I think the chair was going in terms of how much of the school's budget goes to school police, which really should be counted in the policing column as opposed to the youth development column. I guess that's technically not a question. That's just a really upset comment. All right, but then the third one, which is a question, which is then starting on page 29, you have budget highlights. And these all sound great because it all talks about the things we are doing, and the proposed level of funding supports these great numbers. would it be possible for your office to provide us with budget lowlights? Because I'm semi-serious about this. Because if you closed a budget gap of $20 million, there is only one point in this entire document where you talk about cuts, and that's on page 7, where you mention $4 million in reduced grant funding, some of which my colleague Councilman Scott has already addressed in terms of the cut to youth violence prevention. You've only talked about $4 million worth of cuts, but clearly you've made another $16 million somewhere.
Yeah, so let me walk through that.
Okay.
The 20 million gap, that's based on the projections we made back in the fall on what our revenue would look like and what our costs would be to maintain current services. As you know, and this, I know this is sometimes difficult, almost every day we get new information, things change. But let me walk through, there's a combination of revenue increases and spending reductions that help to close that gap. And I can walk through those.
So revenue increases that you are proposing be done?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So in terms of revenue, and you can call this an increase or just a change in assumption, but we went in, given our tortured history with traffic cameras, we went in assuming only that we would get enough revenue to cover expenses.
Okay.
We made a decision just based on consulting with DOT and looking at the program to increase our revenue estimate by $5 million. So it's a total of $8 million. About $3 million of that covers expenses. The rest helps us with our gap.
So $5 million in net revenue.
So that was $5 million was the additional revenue that we.
Did the initial budget project $3 million for the cost of the system?
Yeah, $3 million, which just covers the cost. So it would have been just.
Okay, so the initial
kind of
projection
was
neutral,
right?
And you're projecting an extra $5 million in revenue.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay.
I talked about municipal advertising. We assume $1 million in revenue from that. We also assume additional reimbursement from the Orioles and Ravens for the traffic management and other services we do outside the stadiums.
How much?
But that has to be negotiated. $1 million.
$1 million? $1 million?
We're
we
assuming.
can do better if well, we'll see how they do this week. Okay.
We are also reflecting $700,000 in increased revenue from a new approach to street parking rates. We now have the ability, because we have smart meters, that we can kind of call it congestion pricing on our meters in the downtown area.
You're going to do surge pricing on the parking meters?
The goal is to make sure that there are spaces for people, and we think that will have a positive effect economically as well.
Okay.
Another change in our assumptions has to do with the public safety tax credit. That's the state has passed enabling legislation for a tax credit for public safety employees who live in the city. A bill of that sort came through the council last session and died. That would have provided the tax credit to existing employees who currently live in the city. We have made the assumption that the legislation will only apply to employees who relocate to the city. And
Okay.
that reduced our estimated cost.
You're also making the assumption that that bill gets reintroduced and passed?
We did, yes. Right now, we're only assuming a cost of $300,000.
Okay.
And then on the cost side, I mentioned earlier, we shifted the full cost of street sweeping to the stormwater fund. For the past several years, it's been split between the general fund and the stormwater fund. And that has impacts on the stormwater program. I don't want to minimize those.
What's the cost of that?
$2.6 million.
Ooh.
We have also, we're also in the process of refinancing the convention center hotel loan, and that will reduce costs related to the hotel by about $2.1 million. And
is there a lump sum cost of that? You have to pay to buy that down?
I think it's about $7.5 million. in debt service that we provide each year.
Okay. All right.
Councilman Cohen?
Oh, I'm sorry. Just one more small item. We're rebidding our wellness program contract, and that'll save about $500,000.
You're projecting that the new entity doing that
Will be lower
charge us
cost.
less?
Yes.
Councilman Cohen?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Klein. As a few of my colleagues have mentioned, Baltimore is experiencing a significant wave of violence right now in our communities. One of the things that we know prevents and reduces violence is when young people have after-school activities and when they are occupied. The other thing is we have here in Baltimore a nationally recognized strategy for community schools. Wolf Street Academy in my district went from, I think, being the 77th school in terms of ranking in the city to being, I want to say, the 3rd or the 4th best. The community school model has shown tremendous results. Yet in this year's estimate of ordinance, we're seeing a $3.1 million reduction in funding to the Family League and to the associated black charities, largely around programs that support out-of-school time and community schools. Additionally, the University of Maryland Cooperative and Experience Corp are also looking at a $346,000 cut. Given the violence in our city, given that we know these programs work, why on earth are we making additional cuts to the programs that we know, and we know through years and years of data, support our children and our families in this city?
Councilman, I know that the mayor is certainly open to discussing the use of the youth fund to increase grants for after-school programming.
So the problem with that is that the law is very clear that you cannot use funds, that you cannot appropriate money to an item that was funded last year through the youth fund. So what you did was you took the $3.7 million transfer of appropriation and you said that that was not originally budgeted. But that is not in the spirit of the law, because that $3.7 million transfer of appropriation was the only reason that this council approved the mayor's budget last year, because it was part of our negotiations, period.
The law says that the base for the youth fund is the fiscal 2017 ordinance of estimates. And the dollars that the councilman's talking about were not in the fiscal 2017 ordinance of estimates. So they are eligible for the youth fund.
And Mr. Klein, I don't want to step on the toes of my colleagues. I wasn't here at the time when it was created, but I was part of the advocacy effort, and my students fought for it, and our president put it forward, and the vision was very clear, which was that this would not be used, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. President, but to backfill budget shortfalls, that this would be about supporting young people in new and innovative ways, and that really we want the young people to drive the work around how the youth fund is allocated. I mean, it's not just supposed to be a piggy bank that we raid when we see budget shortfalls. It's supposed to be over and above. So again, to see this reduction to community schools and out-of-school time, which we all in this room and on this council know is not only good for our kids, but it prevents violence in our streets, is just very disappointing. And would love to hear an explanation and to then see that money be put back into the budget.
I mean, if it was intended to work like that, we would have just added the $11.9 million to the fund balance, and then you would have had the flexibility to do with it as you wish. Councilwoman Sneed?
Yes, I'm just curious because the budget highlights So, for an example, the free transit for kids, it says $5.4 million in highway user revenue. Did that come from the city?
That's from the state.
So we
That was
had-
added by the state.
So, under the highlights, and I was just thinking that it should be Baltimore City, things that Baltimore City is doing, and that's the state.
Well, highway user revenue is general fund revenue, but it's a distribution of state
Yeah, we're
gas
just a-
tax and vehicle
We're just a
titling
funnel
tax.
through, right? So it doesn't, it's not ours. It's coming
That's
through
true
the
of a lot of money in the budget. You know, we get state direct aid, we get state grants, federal grants, special grants.
But it's a funnel through. It's funneled through the city. It's the city, but it comes from the state. It should be a state highlight. It's not our money. We're getting it from somewhere else, though.
Yeah, but again, that's true of a lot of money in the city's budget.
It's not a highlight.
Councilwoman Clark?
I just want to pipe in about the money we need and what this youth budget is about. I was here when it started. I was coming back as a council member for a reincarnation as the 14th district representative, and then Stephanie Rawlings Blake was a fellow councilwoman, head of the budget committee, and we were in budget committee. I was on it then, and we decided that she finally said to me, kind of fed up with me, I can't imagine, what do you want? And so I gave her the list, and she went to the mayor, then Martin O'Malley, and came back, and we had the beginnings of a youth and children's fund, and we built on it steadily after that, because we acknowledged that it started out, it was certainly couldn't meet all the needs, but it was a very good start. She did that, she promoted it, she got it, and the council approved it, we all approved it. And so we're still building it. So really, I don't care if it can't, it's irrelevant whether the amount we're building on came through the front door or the back door of last year's budget. It came, it got there. It got there for us to build on. That's how we view the Children's Fund and after-school programs and out-of-school programs. So we're all very clever about what was in the law and what wasn't in the law. It's thousands of children. It's thousands of children's after-school, out-of-school time that we're talking about. And I hear the mayor, or she hasn't said this to me, but I've heard it said that she says it's in the budget because she wasn't here to see what that means. What's in the budget, as you said, is a certain amount that was added to, which was the way that budget got passed. So it was part of that budget. We count on it, we build on it. That's where we find ourselves. So and we voted for the Children and Youth Fund, and we were very careful to make sure it could not be allowed to supplant existing funding, which that money that came after the fact, but the promise before the fact, was part of the budget that can't be substituted for. So I'm just saying that, when you talk about Experience Corps and 4-H, this is perennial. We would like, in this new council, to not go through this again. We're going to fight hard to at least get back to baseline of that after-school budget, which is 2.4. And we're going to have to fight hard, and we're tired of this fight. We're tired of the fight about Experience Corps and 4-H that people support and take care of so many of our children. Can we just have peace in the valley and get ourselves together this year, sort of like as a new council, and start right without too much of a struggle, we would appreciate it. It's the money moves left, the money moves right. We've spent a lot on our children, but not nearly enough. And this council especially is concerned about youth. We just need to do it. This is just me trying to be nice. It's so hard, but I'm trying, because I always like to start that way. Please hear our prayer.
Appreciate that, Councilwoman.
Thank you, Mr. Klein. I hope so.
Councilwoman Middleton.
Thank you. And just to stress over and over again what just about everyone here on the council has stressed, more particularly, I guess I want to focus on, I know my colleague, Councilman Scott, had mentioned about the 17-year-old that was shot in the face. Just this morning, sorry to say that there was another murder, 26-year-old African-American male on Spalding that is now deceased. And, you know, you hear these ages, they're young people, they need jobs, they need activities. I mean, we're at an emergency situation where we need things for our youth. They need attention. It's right in our faces. I saw in the program that, you know, the Safe Streets program is basically in trouble. Mm-hmm. And of course, we have Park Heights Safe Streets, ironically. Yeah. That program in Park Heights is moving very successfully, and the numbers of the murders are not happening in that section. These two recent ones are in the area that's not covered. So that's telling me we need to expand the program. And keep in mind, with the Safe Streets program are ex-offenders that, you know, have been through the system, served time, and they want to help in a nonviolent way. So it's like a wraparound service. It's imperative that that program continues and hopefully spreads in other places. I'm sure there's other programs that are also successful, but it's just an example of we need the money to continue and stay focused on education, on activities, and on jobs. And we are starting to build schools, but also you notice recently the bricks and mortar is not going to make it. We've had recent incidents in the school, terrible things happening in new schools, but the community around it has not been dealt with. So it's just so important, and I know this council we're going to do our hardest this year and try to focus all the needs where they need to be, and we hope we have your support in doing that. Thank you.
Colleagues, anyone else before we move to city schools? Councilman Henry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just still trying to close this $20 million gap because I added up the things you gave me, and we're at 12.7 million in new revenue, and I know we cut $1 million from Safe Streets. I was going to add the cutting $3 million for the emergency transport services, but it says no service impact, and so I don't know what that means.
So another item which again had to do with our projection versus reality, pension costs came in lower. I mean, we get preliminary numbers from the systems, and then we get the final valuations, and they don't always match. So that was about a $4 or $5 million difference.
All right. So other than the $1 million cut to the Safe Streets, which essentially you passed along the reduction in the state grant.
Yeah, we actually there's $200,000 in general fund money that we added in 17 that continues in 18 for Safe Streets. All the rest of the funding for Safe Streets had come from grants.
So
we've lost the grants, so now we are looking at ways to
so we did not
fund that
cut
program.
Our contribution to
No,
Safe
no,
Streets
we did not.
because we were making it.
But our contribution was small.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what other big, and by big meaning the hundred thousands or millions, what other big cuts did we make?
The 5.5 million to the police baseline. We really were focusing on maintaining the current level of service as much as we could across our programs, and again, thanks to some additional revenue and some other actions, we were able to do that. The money from the police department is related to the additional funding for schools.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Councilman Scott?
Just on the contrary to what my colleague just said, can you give us a detail for us, any other than the ones that you mentioned today, any significant increases that we've made in general fund?
Sure, that's pretty much what you see. Just like there aren't many cuts, there also aren't many increases in this budget. We were accommodating the youth fund and the consent decree, pay increases, and so it was difficult, and we weren't able to do a whole lot of enhancements, but we were also able to keep the reductions to a minimum.
Let me ask you a rhetorical question. If the
Okay.
youth fund didn't pass and you had an election, pardon my allergies, an extra $11.9 million, what would you do with it?
I don't know. I can't answer that.
Colleagues, anyone else for finance? Anyone? Mr. Klein, thank you and your staff very much. Appreciate
you.
it. Dr. Santelisa's. So we are holding the second portion of this under the authority of 17-0004R, which is regular oversight of city schools, because we don't have a hearing number. So we do not have an ordinance that has been introduced yet. This is certainly disappointing. We have a situation where you have a significant deficit, and I know that you have been very upfront about your desire to be transparent and to work with stakeholders to try and close that gap. I'd like to personally commend you for that. I can't tell you how surprised most of us were when we heard from you back in the fall that this problem was coming, and it was going to be a very big problem. That being said, the city is being asked to fund something here that is not necessarily the city's responsibility. The reason that we have this deficit in the first place is because of the fact that the state has continued to underfund the school system. And there are other labor-related issues, et cetera, that have contributed to that. Yet the city has continued to increase our contribution, and we are willing to further fight to increase that contribution. In the spirit of working together, Dr. Santelisa's and Allison, I really appreciate our conversation that we had with the council president, and that moving forward, we are going to ensure that the city schools resolution of the mayor and city council, which is essentially the bill that transmits your budget to the city council for approval, is submitted in accordance with state law, which means at least 45 days prior to the end of the fiscal year. We look forward to seeing that happen next year, and we'll be working with you, starting in November, December, as we start to talk about the schedule for the budget process. And I would like to publicly point out that you guys have made that commitment, and that we appreciate that commitment and look forward to working together to ensure that that's followed through on. I know you guys have provided a briefing. If we could jump right into that, and colleagues, just let us know if you have questions as we go through page by page.
Do they not have the PowerPoint? PowerPoint, ladies?
No, this was.
Okay.
No, is this the one you had a separate?
Okay.
Do we have? I thought we had a different document. No.
Which document?
Didn't we already do that? I'm losing my mind here.
No, this is the one. Do you have that electronic?
I don't, but I'm sure I have it on my phone.
If I need something, I'm
That should be the
This wasn't the closeout, though. Yeah, this was not the closeout. We just kind of talked through this at a high level before, right? We're going to talk about the 18 budget at a high level, and then talk about, so we.
closing.
Yeah, do you need the presentation? Brought this up? Yep.
Translated them into outcomes.
Yeah. All right. I have this electronically. I think so. Melissa has it, right?
It was emailed to you last night.
Should I have said hard copies?
Yeah. I'm trying to dig it up.
We don't want any more hard copies. We just want copies.
Oh, we really should be getting stuff digital.
What's that?
For real.
Thank you. Evidently, Councilwoman Miller took it seriously.
Is that thing hooked up to the internet? Is that thing hooked up to the World Wide Web?
And check.
We're gonna recess for 5 minutes.
What happened? Yeah. What happened? Are we not?
We're paused.
Oh, I'll call my granddaughter. I know. What?
Am I stealing it? Are you this one? Okay. Actually, I wasn't permanently stealing. I was going to photocopy.
This isn't like, look at it's an iPad. $400 each one.
Who are students ineligible for funding? I don't remember seeing that category before.
Yes, Council.
It's just going to save us some time from what's a student who's ineligible for funding?
So it could be a student who doesn't have their immunizations, it could be a student, there are certain state requirements, so they have to be there one day in September.
But they're really there.
Yeah. And I've been there.
You can stay. Okay.
Pardon?
You can stay asking.
Well, Big Bird says asking questions is a good way to find things.
That's true.
But they all already watch Sesame Street themselves, and I'm getting tired of people. Well, I guess a lot of them are new.
Well, I think that we're supposed to be skipping a lot of that when I walk through that. We're supposed to be doing
I mean, if you have
overview.
questions, fine, but just so that you know, we're skipping.
We're supposed to be skipping most of the content.
Chairman Costello. It's a good thing.
That's our presentation, but our cost is like 7.2 school place. It doesn't include food. So what that is.
Ready when you are, ma'am.
Oh, great.
Thank you.
And I want to thank, I just want to give a big thank you to the chair and to City Council for your patience with us. Also want to say thank you for the grace with regards to the filing. We will internally, we are realigning around what those processes are, and we'll make sure that we attend to them internally with staff. So thank you for that.
Thank
By way of outset, in terms of just the overview that we'll be providing today, I think, one, it is more than appropriate to start by saying that we began our preparation for fiscal year 18 with knowledge of, and as you noted, Chair Costello, noting that we had a projected $130 million budget gap for fiscal year 18. And I will say between that time when we first met with city council members back in December, I believe, and today, that we have done the work to work with you, work across the city and across the state to close that gap. In large part, and I want to say again publicly because it's no small feat, a thank you to our city delegation, city council, the mayor, the governor, for all of the work that was done to close the gap. In large part, what you will see is that the combined approximately $60 million in additional funding for city schools provides us with the opportunity to basically create a bridge, a 3-year bridge that gives us, one, time to make structural adjustments and maximize efficiencies, to 2, increase enrollment, which is the primary driver of income within city schools, and 3, to begin to advocate for a state funding formula of schools that is indeed fully funded and takes into account concentrated poverty, and as well takes into account what our actual wealth is as opposed to the wealth that's reflected on paper. So the work that we are here to just provide you with an overview of is, first, we will show you how we have in fact closed the gap. As you know, a majority of that $130 million gap was closed with help from both the state and the city. And then 2, we will also go through with you the layoffs that were announced last week officially, and I will just by way of overview let the City Council know that while we went forward with a total combined of 300 layoffs, when we first ran the numbers of potential layoffs near the end of November and December, we were well over 1,000 layoffs projected. The other piece that I think is significant to note is that true to the, I think, focus of our school leaders, overwhelmingly school leaders, family councils worked to make sure that the core of the teaching and learning experience at schools was preserved. And what we are seeing in even now our layoff projections is a relatively smaller number of actual classroom teachers that are slated for layoffs. In fact, we have areas that we know already we will need to hire in. And that is because regardless of the positions that were cut, there are still positions that we will need to recruit for in areas that are always hard to fill and challenging for city schools, such as the area of mathematics, as well as special education teachers. The other piece that I will say that we are pleased with is the fact that the limited resources just reinforce the importance within city schools of being able to hone in on budget priorities. And in light of that, what we have done is maintained our focus that I have spoken widely about, but will just remind City Council, a focus on student wholeness. And in light of the challenges that our city is currently experiencing with increased violence and crime, we are committed and remain committed, and you will see in our proposed FY18 budget that we have maintained and held fairly constant the number of school social workers and school psychologists who will be on hand to support young people and to support staff in meeting those needs. The other area is a focus on literacy. We know from our student achievement results, according to new college and career-ready standards, that too few of our young people are able to meet those newer, higher standards of proficiency. And so we continue to highlight that, and our budget planning will speak to that. And then with regards to staff leadership, we continue to invest in, while at reduced amounts, given our budget gap. At reduced amounts, we will still invest in what we believe our number one frontline investment needs to be, and that is on those who are actually charged with serving our young people directly in the form of teacher leaders and principals. I'll be happy to entertain specific questions, but I am going to ask now for John Walker to come and walk through with us where we are in terms of the closing of the projected budget gap, and then I will ask the Chief of Staff, Allison Perkins Cohen, to walk through with us the further implications with regards to where we are with layoffs, and then I'm more than happy to entertain further questions. John?
Thank you. Once again, I'm John Walker. I'm the Interim Chief Financial Officer for Baltimore City Schools. And we want to go through real quickly is some of the contributors or the drivers of our annual budget caps and where we got to the structural place that we got. Number one was our revenue. We had flat revenue from the state because our enrollment, actually we had declining revenue from the state because our enrollment has declined, and the wealth of Baltimore City in relation to the rest of the state of Maryland rose at a faster pace than the rest of the state of Maryland. Those two factors actually contributed to a significant reduction in state aid as the formula is written. So we have revenue issues that control and enrollment issues that control. We have student need. As everyone here knows, we have the children in Baltimore City have some of the highest needs of any of the children in the state of Maryland, and with that comes some additional resources that are needed in order to educate those children. We have a range of schools. We have small schools. We have some larger schools. We recognize that moving down the road, we need to right size our footprint and so forth and so on. But again, as everyone knows, closing a community school is more than just a financial matter. That's a very important thing, and we take it very seriously. So we want to make sure that we maintain our schools and we do it right. When the time comes, we want to do it right. We have old buildings. The fact that we have old buildings means that we have higher maintenance costs in order to keep things going as time goes on. We do our best to try to keep everything going. As we are moving forward with the 21st Century Plan, we will start to replace and renovate some of our schools. But again, that's a process that takes many years, and while that happens, the buildings that we have need additional maintenance and repair in order to keep them running properly. Salaries and benefits, we had an innovative teacher contract that went in that made our teachers get the rewards that they should have gotten for educating our children. And as a result, there's a cost to that. So we had the teacher contract was also one of the drivers. Now, how we went about closing the gap, as you know, we started way back in December or so with approximately a $130 million budget gap. Our projected expenditures exceeded our projected revenues by $130 million. Through advocacy, we were able to go to Annapolis and through the city, and we were able to get a package that gave us a total of $59 million in fiscal year 18 and approximately $180 million over a 3-year period. But we had about $59 million in additional revenue and services in fiscal year 18. So that was the first piece. We made cuts in our central office budgets. We couldn't cut them quite as deeply as we have in the past because the district has been cutting the central office budgets each year for the past 4 years in order to try to maintain schools at the level that they could be maintained. So the district office had been reduced to a very, very minimal amount, and so in some cases further cuts we would have had to cut out whole pieces of what we do. So, we made cuts to central office, but they weren't as great as they had been in previous years. So part of that. And then the withdrawal from fund balance. We recommend that we are taking about $21 million from our fund balance as a source to balance the gap for fiscal year 18. The other thing that we did is we had to cut our school budgets by $30 million. When we originally started this process, before we had got the state aid and before we came up with some other ideas, we were looking at a $90 million cut to our schools. When we received the additional funding from the state and the city, the decision was made by the administration at the school system that that entire $60 million would go back into school budgets. So everything that we got in additional revenue and services, we put right back into school budgets. So we put $60 million back there, but that still left a cut of $30 million in our schools. The last thing that we did is when we went back and started looking at the original projections that we had done and saw there were some areas where we could slow the growth. When you do projections, you estimate things are going to go up by a certain percentage. We think we were able to slow the growth in some areas like utilities and some other things. And that's how we balanced the last $10 million to close the $130 million gap. And with that, I will turn it over to Ms. Perkins Cohen, our Chief of Staff.
Okay, can you go to slide 13? So I want to talk a little bit about the reduction of force that we've talked about. As Dr. Santalisa said, it's been reduced significantly from when we originally discussed it publicly, than when we thought it was going to be over 1,000 staff. And we were also very pleased with the way that our school leaders prioritized classroom teachers in terms of the way that they utilized the resources that they had and the instruction, and they focused on the instruction of our students. So at this point, we're saying that it'll be no more than 300 staff members that are affected. The key, there will, in terms of classroom teachers, it's going to be, we think it'll be no more than 75 classroom teachers that are in the core content areas. There is a significant impact on counselors, school counselors, and librarians. So those are areas that within the BTU that are significantly impacted. Guidance counselors and librarians do see a relatively significant impact, but core classroom teachers, the impact is relatively low. Within the principals union, assistant principals do see significant impacts, and then other layoffs are kind of across position areas across the district and so some of those key support positions that you see in other district positions are things like secretaries and office assistants. You see that in schools and within the district. There will be a maximum of 50 positions eliminated from the district office, and as John said, there was limits to the degree to which we could continue to cut in the district office. We've cut the district office several years in a row, and so we really are impacting our ability to do our work effectively. And then school police will be impacted. All of our unions will be impacted. School police will be impacted. They will not have layoffs, but there will be a hiring freeze. We will not fill existing positions.
Ms. Perkins, just
Sure.
real quick, when we're talking about no more than 75 classroom teachers, is there, as it relates to the numbers of pupils per teacher, is there any threshold that we're looking to make certain that, a class isn't such and such, size 30, 35,
Yeah. So we don't have a set number that we hold schools to. However, we in this year's budget, in particular, since some of the cuts were, we did 2 rounds of budgeting with schools. So we did because initially we didn't know how much funding we would have. So we did an initial round of school budgets with schools where they really engaged their school communities and developed their priorities, and that was with the more significant cuts that initially thought were possible. Then they did a kind of a second round of cuts where they, using those same priorities they had discussed with their communities, they came back and identified what they would do with the additional resources we put back. In both cases, when they came to the district office to identify their spending priorities, we did what we called budget collaboratives, where we sat around the table with the principal supervisors, with staff from special education, from human capital office, from kind of the key offices, to look at the way they had prioritized their resources. And so we really did look for areas, both in the original way that they budgeted their schools, and then when they added dollars back, to make sure that there weren't particularly problematic impacts. Like, we really look for split classrooms. In the first round of budget, the lower level, some schools had to do split classes, and so we tried to make sure that those were addressed in the second round. And then there were some larger class sizes that we tried to really address in the second round. So we don't have a set number, but we did really look very carefully about how schools staff to try to make sure there were not particularly large classes that were impacting students.
And in these cuts, would it mean that any schools would be without, say, an art teacher, music, those types of programs as well? Are they
Yeah, so we were really pleased to see that art teachers were not, that overall the arts were not negatively impacted, that there were, there's overall an increase actually in arts positions. I'm right of that, but there are certain areas within there where there are some arts, I want to say music, where we're down, I think. Yes, it's music where it's down, but most of the other dance, drama, and visual arts are actually up in terms of the number of positions. So that's not an area where we saw the schools take reductions, which we were really pleased about.
Council President.
Yes, if we're able to identify the 10 million, how would that affect the 300 staff members?
So the 10 million, so the challenge is in terms of when we receive it. So at this point, we would probably use that to impact the budget adjustments that we do in the fall. We have now, we are in the process. The timeline is such that we're in the process where we have to notify staff. So we're going through the careful process of matching up what we have in terms of the positions from the schools, as well as what we have from staff in terms of when they've identified in terms of whether they're going to stay, where they have intent to stay this year, and then matching up the certifications. That's a very cumbersome process. We're still in that. We don't know exactly who's going to be impacted. So that process, we by union rules have to notify staff of implications.
I understand that, but
by the end of this month. So in terms of actually these dollars, that if we got them, they would really probably impact the budget adjustments that would happen in the fall. So the budget adjustments in the fall would mean that we could add positions back, and so some of these positions who have been laid off many of these positions have recall rights, so we might be able to call teachers back. But in terms of preventing the layoff in this round, where we are in the process is we couldn't really prevent it from happening this summer, but in the fall we could add positions back if we had additional dollars to give to schools.
Okay, not to go too far into what you're doing with the unions, but what were you able to get in terms of healthcare costs? Because I know that the city, we saved a lot of money because we had to pay more into our healthcare, and I want to know about that.
Yeah, so
we
were able to reach agreement with the unions on healthcare. I think because we're going to impasse, we can't talk about the specifics of what we reached, but we were able to reach agreement on healthcare. It was within salary and compensation where we were not able to reach agreement with them.
Okay, Mr. Klein, if the school system did exactly what we did with our health care, how much of a savings would that be?
We've estimated it would be in the $15 million to $20 million range.
Wow.
Just based on cost per employee.
Mm-hmm. If they did the same thing that
they did the exact same thing, yeah.
Okay. Well, Madam CEO, I hope you heard that. If we can get some concessions on the healthcare costs, like we had to take as city government with all our employees, that's almost $15 to $20 million right there. That could save all 300 of those jobs.
Sure. And again, Council President, I think what we would need to match up is some of the coverage that we provide that the city does not provide, and vice versa. I think that we have differences with regards to retirees, correct? Right, so like the city covers retirees, we don't for healthcare, so we would need to balance that out. But certainly one of the things that we targeted for this negotiation period was healthcare specifically.
Excuse me for 1 minute.
Yep.
You said that the city don't cover retirees?
The city does, but we do not.
Y'all do not?
But we do not.
So we cover the retirees, am I correct?
We
They
yeah, we
cover
pay
our
for the
retirees.
school system retiree health benefits.
Right, okay, because I was getting a little confused.
Yes, but it's
So
not
we
for
pay for them, so if they paid more for their health care costs, they could save some of their colleagues, is the point I'm trying to make.
Right, and so, and again, as part of this negotiations, we have recaptured savings in healthcare. The challenge is more one of timing, and I was referencing this earlier in another context, that even though we have savings, by the time it takes effect in the plan, right? Like, because we're already halfway through this year. By the time it takes effect, we won't realize the full savings this year. It will take us another full year before we realize the full savings.
Okay.
Councilman Slifer.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. So it's my understanding that, the $10 million that, the council president and the council is fighting for would be saving these jobs and instead of being just an adjustment that you guys would be making in the fall. And so to echo the council president's question, I mean, $10 million, at the very least, that's 100 jobs?
So what I would say to that, Councilman, is that yes, roughly. What we are doing, though, because we've committed in our agreement with the state around the need to make structural changes, is that we have already talked about prorating whatever we receive in addition across a 3-year period, because we're budgeting across a 3-year bridge period. So whichever. Basically, we would split that contribution across a 3-year period.
I gotcha. So to that, I would just ask that if there's if you can just get back to the committee with a specific dollar amount that it would take as far as these 75 classroom teachers, what would that cost? What kind of commitment are we looking for this year over the next 3 years, as you would put it? I mean, because even if we were to stretch that out over 3 years, I mean, that's still
Absolutely.
30 jobs. And so,
Yes.
I told you from day one when we had our first hearing on this, I hate to see the classroom teachers be included on this, because that's the worst thing you could do.
Absolutely.
And so I think that if we can keep working on that $10 million, we'd like to know that we're saving teachers in classrooms rather than helping you adjust things in the fall. Not that that's not important, but you see where our priorities are.
No, without a doubt, and we could certainly do that. I think what Ms. Perkins-Cohen was referring to is pretty much the timing. So we have to notify staff of layoffs within a certain time period. That doesn't mean so we're going forth by May 30, right? So by June 1st, our target's May 30, because by June 1st, we have to, based on the contract requirements, signal to staff who are targeted for layoff. That does not mean, however, that we won't do callbacks. And we're working now to reduce that number. So the human capital staff is working through looking at, for example, targeted staff to see if there are additional certifications or other roles that they could push into.
So, and I mean, that's emotionally draining on somebody to get called back.
It
I
is.
mean, that definitely affects your quality of work moving forward, whether you like it or not. And so if May 30th is the deadline, so that basically would leave us, about 2 weeks to figure that out. So if you can, try to provide that information as soon as possible, what the 75 teachers in the classroom cost, whether you're breaking it out over 3 years or however you're going to structure that, I think it's important for this committee and for the entire council to know that number, so that we at least have that opportunity to do, what the council president has been fighting very hard to accomplish, and we don't want to see those efforts go out in vain.
Sure. No, and we can provide that.
Thank you.
We can provide that.
Councilman Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Santelises and Allison. First of all, I appreciate your leadership in the effort to close the gap. And I also appreciate that I think through this effort, we were able to change some of the narrative on city schools away from the funding deficit being about fiscal mismanagement toward what it really is, which is inequity, largely driven by a state that has underfunded city schools for many years, which their own MSDE has shown. That being said, I do think, to echo and pick up on what my colleagues have been saying, a big part of our advocacy effort on this council was this call about we're all in. That's what Maggie McIntosh, chairman of the Appropriations Committee, and Mayor Pugh, and then our city council, when we committed to cut $10 million from the budget. So I am disappointed to read in a memo today that the conversation with the union fell apart. And I say that as a former teacher, as a former BTU member, and as someone who cares very deeply about how we treat our teachers, and who actually feels that on the whole, teachers in Baltimore are underpaid. But I know you can't talk about the specifics of the negotiation, but I think I'm feeling disappointed, and I think members of this council are feeling disappointed that that call of we're all in has not seemingly been reciprocated across the board.
So I think the way that I would characterize it, Councilman Cohen, is that we had numerous areas where we were in agreement. So to the last point, we were in agreement about the need to recoup savings around healthcare. We were in agreement about the need to implement the current contract in a way that frankly was more efficient, and that we administered far more closely to reduce the cost. I think what this impasse is, and we had our very last meeting on it yesterday, what it represents is one area in the contract where we disagree, and one area in the contract happens to be compensation. And that area, again, we can't get into the details right now around that, but it is one area out of many where we did have agreement. And what this signals from our standpoint is a recognition on both sides that we need a third party to weigh in. And we need a third party to weigh in to see whether the ask on both sides is reasonable in light of the overall fiscal condition of the district.
Understood. And then my follow-up question, to return to something that I was discussing with Mr. Klein, is around the importance of community schools and after schools. Having taught in Curtis Bay, which now feeds into Ben Franklin High School, I can tell you when I taught at Curtis Bay, the common threat that parents would make when their kids were misbehaving was, I'm going to send you to Ben if you don't shape up. That has completely shifted 180 degrees to where Ben is now one of the best schools in our city. And recognize Councilman Reisinger, it's in his district in South Baltimore, but they are just doing phenomenal work. They have the Ben Center. I've been able to take a tour. There is just outstanding things happening, and I believe that a large part of that is because Ben became a community school. And the work that the community school coordinator has done to leverage resources in Curtis Bay, South Baltimore, has been outstanding. Similarly, in my district, Wolf Street Academy, again, going from one of the worst in our city to one of the best. I think that community schools have proven again and again and again to not only be good for kids, but good for families and communities as well. And I was wondering if you could weigh in, as again, we're continuing to have this conversation between the council and the administration about the impact that you see being provided by our community schools.
No, absolutely. And I will say I will credit the City School Board of Commissioners. When I arrived back in Baltimore City, there was already a very robust commitment to expanding the number of community schools. I met yesterday with Mike Casserly, who is the head of the Council of Great City Schools, which is the national organization for large urban school districts. And we were having this discussion around the needs of young people in concentrated poverty. And while there is still a narrative of question around the fact that part of why it takes more to educate young people living in concentrated poverty touches on what you just noted with community schools, because we know that when schools serve as a hub of wraparound services for young people, for whom their families, it's very challenging to get service, when there is medical care, when there is child care, when there are feeding programs. It's part of why we as a district are really expanding the supper program, and we want there to be more opportunities for young people to receive 3 meals a day. We know from our school leaders in places that serve large numbers of young people impacted by violence, whether they have lost a family member, whether they are the victims of crime. We know that having things like art therapy on site makes a difference for those young people. So what I think you're touching on, Councilman Cohen, is what frankly the Board of Commissioners had already committed to. And I think if we really understand what the research is saying, and like I said, I was in Washington yesterday with Mike Casserly. He reaffirmed, he actually even offered to come and testify if there is a need to. The research is clear that young people living in concentrated poverty who have access to the kinds of services, the kind of collaboration shown in a number of our higher performing community schools, their life outcomes, their academic outcomes can be equivalent to young people coming from middle class homes or from greater resourced communities. So if there's ever a point where you not only need our advocacy for that, there's also national leaders who are more than willing to come to Baltimore and reaffirm what I think this council knows, what we know as schools and educators really is an important thread if we are serious about addressing true equity in education. It's one thing to talk about it, but if we are ignoring the resources and ignoring the research, we're really not going to get there.
And my final point on that, President Young and Chairman Costello and I were having this conversation yesterday, is that from my analysis, the community school strategy is also about leverage, and it's about, each dollar that goes in, kind of like you were saying, is able to contribute to supporting, bringing in these partnerships, which it's high leverage, high yield. Is that also your understanding of what?
It absolutely is, because one of the things that we know and we believe is that in many of our neighborhoods, our communities, schools are one of the last remaining, frankly, institutions, permanent institutions that families can rely on. And I think to your point about leverage, sometimes it doesn't necessarily mean more, it just means leveraging the resources that we have. And so we have a greater focus on that within city schools. We have expanded a number of partnerships, and I can't count, and I think it's a credit to our city, the number of people who, even when I am in the grocery store, walk up to me and say, we want to help the young people of Baltimore, not be victims of crime, but actually be productive citizens. How can we lend a hand? And one of the challenges we have at city schools is just having enough infrastructure to be able to direct people to that. But I think you're absolutely right.
Yes.
Great.
Councilwoman Clark.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. I know it's been a long day. Wait, am I on?
Yes. Yes.
Hello?
Nope.
Um,
Yeah. Perfect.
Thanks. I'll give it back. I'm trying to figure out the long view. We heard about a $130 million gap, and it was a structural deficit, and 1,000 teachers. Now, and I'm not. That's what we heard, and believed and believe. Now we're down to 75 teachers that are up for layoff. But it's even and other personnel adding up to 300.
very important other personnel. We started out 1,000 teachers. So, like, I was going to make a wild bet that we'd end up with maybe from 300 to 125 teacher layoffs, but it's at 75. But if we raise 10 million here, you really would like to use it for adjustments in the fall about things, probably when the union negotiations get it resolved. My question is this where we are? Is this? Let me rephrase this. I want our school system to be back at full flag, but back in full action. We're going through this, from my view, we're going through a period of restrained resources, trying to hold on to our most important resources: teachers, principals, the people who make schools run, which includes a lot of other people, guidance counselors,
That's right.
the whole array. So what I don't want to see us do is get down to a level of funding that we can survive on and think that what that is changing in any way the structural deficit. We have a structural deficit. The world has a structural deficit. The school system has a structural deficit. I don't know what a structural deficit really is, except that it means we're never going to we're always going to be struggling. So my biggest question is, we still don't know about these 300 because, as your report says, and we know, a lot of people are going to retire. A lot's going to happen that people choose that's going to affect these numbers. And so we'll finally come to an understanding of what the real cost has been to us. But for the money we contribute through trying to work with the mayor, it's really, really important to us, as my colleague has indicated, that we keep the people, use that money as much as possible to keep the people that run our schools, the people, and not try to keep the number of personnel down to a certain level as part of a structural regrouping. Mm-hmm. Do you follow what I'm saying?
I believe so, but let me know when, if there's a specific question, you can let me know whether I'm answering it, Councilman Clark.
Okay, the specific question is, are you satisfied, because there's no good way to ask this, if this 300 remains, will that be how the school system will operate thereafter, to the best of your knowledge? I mean, you don't know forever. In other words, will there be an effort to build us back up as a school system, or will that just be the structural deficit that got resolved?
So what I would say on that is it's twofold. I think in the short term, we have a responsibility to deliver a balanced budget, right? I think that schools are very clear, and we saw this when we added back $60 million to school budgets. And, you know, as Mr. Walker noted earlier, every dollar that came in addition back into the district, we immediately pushed into schools. And what we saw was that school leaders, school communities prioritized the very positions that you just referenced. And so we can, which is why we will get back to you with the actual number, that any additional savings that the city council targets or yields, we can identify how that goes back into schools. I think moving forward, though, my goal has never been to make sure that we cut enough to get to FY18 and then just operate at a lower level, right? The district, so for
Correct.
example, right, one of the areas that is being cut, for example, is librarians. Well, what's interesting is 4 years ago when I was chief academic officer, we made a deliberate investment back into school librarians because the national research shows that kids' reading achievement increases with the proliferation of school libraries. So we reinvested back in school librarians. We know, I know, the board knows that normal should not be half the schools don't have school librarians.
Right, and that, is that going to be, so
No.
that's just my concern, that,
Yeah.
that the state, that the people that are deciding on the next formula in the Kerwin process, and I know, I hope you're part of that.
Absolutely.
Will look at what we've brought ourselves to and say, well, how can we help them maintain this, and we'll give them an annual increase. That we don't want where we have to be right now to be
Absolutely.
our baseline.
No, and it's not. And I think the other piece to point out, which we didn't speak to as quickly in the overview, is we are also engaged in a very intentional enrollment campaign. As a matter of fact, regardless of the fact that we went to impasse today with the Baltimore Teachers Union, we're also partnering with them and the city around how to increase enrollment now, right? We have teams getting ready to go out within the next month and in August to re-engage families, because we know that when our enrollment goes up, our revenue goes up. The other piece that we're doing, if once you get to review the budget, is part of why we were reinvesting in some of the other extracurricular activities that we know kids need. We know kids need, for example, and that's not extracurricular, to have hands-on science opportunities in elementary school, because all families want their young people to have an enriching experience. They don't want their kids to just go in and say, I just do math and I do reading all day. And so part of our role is, one, to get the word out so we can increase enrollment. Two, to make sure we have quality programming, because what we all know is where we have quality school leaders, right? So it is about community schools, but it's about community schools coupled with high-performing instructional leadership teams, right? Where we get actual outcomes for kids. We don't have any issue in the city, you know this as well as I do, with schools that families see as viable options that are getting outcomes for kids. So it's a combination of a lot of things. And then finally, to your point about Kerwin, we are advocating. We are, again, trying to educate the general public about what we know with regards to the needs of young people living in concentrated poverty. It's not just following one child from a low-income family to one school. We know that there are additional resources, and if you look at other countries and other states that have made those investments, those are the districts, those are the urban districts across the country that are considered fast, rapidly improving urban school districts. We know what that trajectory looks like. So I would say it's a multi-pronged approach, and what I have said from the beginning, what the board has said from the beginning, is that we wanted a 3-year period of time to give us as the system the ability to put some of those things in play, because we believe that there are enough families, enough young people who want to select Baltimore City as their choice, but we need time to make sure that we have the schools to receive them. We have to do that at the same time that we're advocating to the Kerwin Commission, and at the same time that we have a real assessment of what city wealth is.
Thank you.
Councilman Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madam CEO, I just want to follow up on the questions and comments from my colleague from the 1st District. To me, it seems that with all of us knowing the impact that community schools have, and we know how much the investment in one community school can mean for the entire city, not just those families, it seems to me that we should be developing a plan over the next 5 to 10 years to make every Baltimore City public school a community school. So I just want to put that out there to see if we can begin to have that conversation so that in 5-10 years from now, we're not picking one school over the next, but making sure that we're building the infrastructure, and not just in the community schools model, because we all know that it has to be, the infrastructure has to be there for those community organizations, because community schools are only as good as the organizations that we have running them. That's all.
No, and I would agree, Councilman Scott, and I think what you'll see, and what, like I said, the board has been very clear, and when the board voted on city schools, community schools policy, that was a very kind of public commitment for every school in city schools to, in fact, be a community school.
Councilman Stokes.
I just have a question, a statement. If and when the current formula is changed, will it include the lost revenue that the state has not paid Baltimore City, or are we going to be coming back here again talking about laying off teachers and support staff?
I think that's a great question, and I think it's one that needs to be posed to our colleagues at the state level who are putting the formula together. I mean, one of the most illuminating elements of information that I think surfaced during the last couple of months is that had the state fully funded city schools across a period of time, we would have an additional, what was it, $290 million, and I wouldn't be standing here in front of you, and I wouldn't be hanging my hat on the Kerwin Commission. I mean, part of what we have to, and I've said this continually and will continue to say it because it's true and it's backed up, that unless a community decides what its investment in its young people is going to be and follows through on that investment, we can then not turn around and wonder why we have the outcomes for our young people that we have.
One more I just want to mention, even though next year is election time for state delegates and senators and governors, this council and yourself can lobby them during that time of the year when everybody say they're going to give you something. So I think it's a great time to lobby them. And I just have one more statement. In terms of the data, when young people leave, when parents want a choice, they have charter schools, they have community schools. Can you get a council the data on when those schools close or when those particular pupils leave, how much it costs and what it costs on the city budget when that, I guess it's $17,000 per student, once it comes out of that school? Do you have any data that you can share with us to just show the deficit?
Sure. So if just let me speak back to you to make sure that I'm hearing you, Councilman, if that's all right. We can prepare data that will show you the numbers of young people leaving city schools, period, because I'll just remind us all that students that attend charter schools in city schools are in fact public school students still. So we can show you that, and we can also show you the breakdown between which type of school, city schools, young people are enrolled in. Would that address the question?
Thank you.
Okay, great.
Councilman Burnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dr. Santelises, for valuable information per usual. I know we see you a lot on the Education and Youth Committee. I just had two questions. One, you mentioned one of the largest impacts will be assistant principals. And really the question is with two parts. One, how is the expectation that principals will be able to maintain operations? And two, are those cuts prioritized by size? And the reason I ask that is, you know, some of the larger schools, I know it can be very difficult to have that loss of administrative support, whereas a smaller school may be able to operate with less, even though it is still a struggle, because I've worked with both small schools that did not have APs or had very little administrative support. Is there a prioritization process in the selection of that?
So those are great questions. First, just as a reminder, with school-based budgeting in city schools, those decisions are made at the school level, so there's no kind of mandate centrally. Although all of our principal supervisors review each school budget to make sure there are no what I would call drastic or outlier types of cuts, so that's one point. The second is that the total number of assistant principals in some cases reflects not a total zeroing out of any assistant principals, but it might be a reduction. So for a larger school that might currently have 3 assistant principals, they may be reducing by 1 AP position to have 2 assistant principals, or going from 2 to 1. Does it have an impact? Absolutely, but we've worked very, very hard to make sure that schools are not at a critical level. I will also say that our investment in developing social emotional learning programming and curriculum for our schools, we're hoping will also help, and from a preventative standpoint, develop a more positive school climate. But I'm not also going to stand here and say just randomly cutting assistant principals has no impact. It does. What I think we're trying to do is mitigate the impact that it has.
That's helpful, because I used to work with a school that the principal just regularly did not include funding for an assistant principal, because she wanted the money to go to other programs, which was great, but she was also incredibly difficult to work with because she had no time to do anything else but run the school. So it made it difficult to partner with her on different projects and leverage resources for the school. So that was really why I had that concern, just thinking about that one experience.
Sure.
The second, it was very encouraging to hear that there is outreach being done for marketing the schools. I know that was something we had talked about heavily in previous hearings around changing the narrative and highlighting the positive things that are going on in our city schools. Right. Is there any work being done? So to preface this, I have a few neighborhoods that border the county, and often what I see is a lot of young people, once the children get 4th, 5th grade, the parents pull them out, they move over to the county, or they send them to private school. Is there work being done to maintain those students as well? Because as they get older, and I think the numbers bear that out, that there is some attrition around that age.
No, and actually one of the areas that we have begun focusing on even this year is our middle grades programming, because to your point, we lose large numbers of city schools families around that 5th, 6th grade year for exactly the reason that you're saying. And one of the things that we have really started going deep on, I won't say we've gone deep yet, is the fact that even though we moved years ago to a K-8 structure from a middle school self-contained structure, we just changed the structure. We did not embellish the programming. We didn't make sure that the needs of early adolescents were being met in those programs. And we know from the Fund for Educational Excellence's recent study, and if the council hasn't reviewed it, I encourage every member of City Council to read the Fund for Educational Excellence's report, an analysis that they did of choice in Baltimore City. And one of the things that report highlighted and just confirmed for us is the fact that our middle grades academic programming is bifurcated in the city, meaning if you get into a rigorous middle grades program, then you go on to the high schools in this city that are producing the most college-ready young people, and if you don't, then your options are far more limited. And so all of that has pointed to what you are citing in the data, and that is we need to do a better job at providing robust middle grades programming if we're going to keep some of those families who may be satisfied and actually pleased with elementary school. We need to be able to show them that we have robust options for their young people in middle grades.
Agreed. And maybe it's too soon for you to answer this, but I know that there's also an exploration of rezoning and restructuring of some of the schools. Does that factor into both this conversation around the budget potentially? I just don't know the timeline for that.
Right.
Or
we're still in a very exploratory phase.
Okay.
I know that the rumors, and I'll take this opportunity to dispel them. I know the rumors were that we were rezoning beginning in September.
Yeah.
That's very far from the truth. A lot of the public sessions we were having most recently were really geared to get the feedback from communities. So we are far away from actually proposing new zones. Yes, it's been, I think, 20 years. Has it been a long time? It's been close to 20 years since we have done anything with zoning in the city, and it's time. And so we're preparing for it, but we are not right now proposing any zones nor taking feedback on specific proposals.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
Councilwoman Sneed.
When I was looking through the pages of the budget, and then just thinking about I didn't see teachers that would retire. So I'm wondering with the 300 teachers that, may be laid off, if the budget was taken into considerations of retirement.
Okay, okay. Sorry, I have folks flipping the pages for me, so I'm not really sure where I'm supposed to be. That's okay. So we did take into account the number that we released last week, takes into account the retirements that we have to date. So one of the clarifications is that number that went out was as of that date. We know that there will be shifts. We know that there are folks who will decide to retire who have not told us yet, which is part of why we continue to emphasize that these numbers are tentative and that they are ever changing. We have weekly meetings. Our human capital team has weekly calls scheduled with each of the collective bargaining units, because we know a lot of that data is changing. We also know traditionally we have a lot of resignations from teachers in June and July, because by the contract, teachers have until the mid-July, July 15th, right? Yes. Have until July 15th to separate with the district. So we have still a significant portion of time in which we'll have fairly significant staffing shifts.
So normally, how many teachers normally retire?
I don't know about retirement per se. DeRay, do you know how many by retire? It varies. Okay, so it's about 60 in terms of retirements a year, but I will say on average when both Ms. Perkins-Cohen, Mr. McKesson, and I came in July, we had at that time, about 650 vacancies? And that's about average for us. So again, we'll deal with those shifts as well, which will also impact the layoff callbacks.
Okay. If there are no further questions, thank you, Dr. Santelises. Thank you, Mr. Klein.
Thank you.
This hearing stands in recess. However, we will hold a hearing on the Baltimore City Public School budget for the fiscal year ending June 30th, 2018, sometime in June, to be announced at a later date. Thank you.